welcome. Good morning to everyone. My name is Nikolaus von Peter. I'm working for the European Commission in Germany, dealing with, inter alia, with digital issues. And it's a good tradition that the third day of the European Data Summit is happening here at the European House, which is your house. It's not the European Commission's house, it's your house. And not only so that this summit deserves the title European, but also to fill this house with these topics and these people. And I have to say that it's a real gift, Pencho, to have this summit at the end of the year. We're all tired and exhausted, and you still managed to get these three days to set them up. And one reason why I put on my Christmas trousers, to thank you for that gift. And because you normally expect these kind of truly international events to happen in Brussels, but it's important that they happen here, because if you know, European Union is in Pirmasens and in Bratislava and in Berlin, as it is. That's the European Union, no? It's not just in Brussels. So I hope we have a particularly productive day today. We're going to start off with a speech by the Honourable Member Collins, Damian Collins from the UK Parliament. And I've heard yesterday, Pencho told me that convergence is very important, that it's like a buzzword, it's something we're all very eager to achieve, and we're happy to start off with that kind of input, where we're going to see if there is indeed some sort of convergence between what the UK is doing, what the EU has been doing. And then we're going to put the DSA in that context. I'm going to discuss here with you and others if there is this kind of convergence and what's perhaps different and what's better, not so good. And then we're going to have two other topics, which are a bit more perhaps data related, where we try to see specifically with two areas, two sectors, what the data economy would actually mean to Europe and how we can implement the Data Governance Act. Through then close the day on another issue, which is again related, which is the Data Act. Yeah? So that's just to welcome you all here. Also the people who will hopefully watch this later on YouTube, many of them should watch it, because it's always interesting what's happening in these events that you set up, Pencho. Many thanks for having invited me to this event at the European House. And again, a warm welcome to you. And now I hand over, Pencho, to you for the rest of the day.
It's always such a great pleasure to collaborate with Nikolaus, because the collaboration functions really, really perfect. And as you said, I feel as if I'm in Brussels. We are indeed at the European Commission. And as you said, the European Commission is not only in Brussels, but in every European city. We have great topics for today. We continue the discussion from yesterday when it comes to the concrete implementation of the Data Act with the two concrete, tangible examples of the European health data space and the mobility health data space. But before, as Nikolaus said, we're going to focus on one convergence issue. As we know, we have two milestones in Europe, or a couple of milestones besides the GDPR. We have started, or we have to start in a couple of months with the implementation of the Digital Markets Act, and next to the Digital Markets Act, certainly the implementation of the Digital Services Act. And as we know, since the experiences with the Brexit, we have similar model in the UK with the online safety bill, and it's my greatest pleasure that we have with us in person Damian Collins, great friend of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, member of parliament, and former digital minister I believe, in two British governments. Dear Damian, it's my greatest pleasure that you are with us today, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pencho, and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for inviting me to come here and speak at the European Data Summit. I've been pleased to attend numerous meetings organised by the Foundation in my 12 years as a Member of Parliament. Their work to support dialogue around the world with policymakers and parliamentarians here in Germany is greatly valued by everyone who is engaged in such events. I would say as well, particularly as we're meeting here in Berlin, that I believe sharing insights, ideas and experience as we develop public policy to meet the challenges of the digital age will be hugely beneficial to all. I will certainly do all I can to promote such discussions, but not just between the UK and Germany, but between the UK and the European institutions, because it's important that as a good neighbour we work together on the continent that we all share. This is an important moment to be discussing the regulation of user-to-user services like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Online platforms are increasingly the public square of our democracies, the place where people go for news and to exchange ideas. They allow people to speak out, to reach new audiences with greater ease than ever before. However, they have also become places where truth is drowned out by disinformation, public health undermined by conspiracy theories. People daily face intimidation. Children are encouraged to self-harm. And where the foundations of our public institutions, including government, parliament, and the media, are being undermined. Some of this has been fueled as well by the active campaigning of hostile foreign states like Russia, who use disinformation as a weapon. The great danger that societies face today is not so much one big lie, but that people no longer know what to believe or who to trust. We cannot leave child safety and the health and strength of the public square to a black box. The laws we have established to protect people in the offline world need to apply online as well. We are now seeing different approaches around the world to setting standards to keep people safe on social media. From the work of the eSafety Commissioner in Australia, the passing of the Digital Services Act in the European Union, and the UK's Online Safety Bill, which will be approved by the House of Commons in the next few weeks. In the United States of America as well, there is growing consensus that the liability shield created by Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act needs to be reformed, even if you're not yet in agreement on how. What lies at the heart of all these approaches is the idea that platforms should be held to account for enforcing the community standards they promise to their users and to prevent their services being used to break the law. For most users, their experience on social media platforms is not that of searching for content, but content finding them. Recommendation tools driven by artificial intelligence are data profiling users in order to provide them with content they are most likely to engage with. This process is designed to hold people's attention for as long as possible and to prompt them to return as often as possible. These systems were not always central to the user experience on social media, but have been developed for business reasons by the platforms. It is in this part because of their active curation of content that social media companies cannot claim to be the neutral hosts of words, images, and films created and shared by others on their platform. They are shaping the experience to make money from it, and they should have a liability for that. We should be concerned as well about the impact of AI-driven recommendation tools on user experiences on social media and how they shape their view of themselves and the world. In the UK, a coroner's court recently determined that a 14-year-old girl, Molly Russell, I quote from the report here, died from an act of self-harm while suffering from depression and the negative effects of online content. The truth is that if you are a vulnerable person, those vulnerabilities will be detected by the social media platforms and will influence what you see. Someone who is already self-harming is more likely to see content that will encourage them to continue to do so, and worse. Recent data published by NHS Digital in the UK has shown that for more than a quarter of 17 to 19-year-olds had probable mental health issues in 2022, compared to 1 in 6 the previous year. In 2017, that rate was just over 10% in that age group. 1 in 8 of 11 to 16-year-old users of social media reported that they had been bullied online. This rose to nearly 1 in 3 amongst those with a probable mental health issue. Among all 17 to 24-year-old social media users, 1 in 5 young women had experienced online bullying, compared to half that number amongst young men. There was a time that a child could escape a bully and find a safe place at home. But there is no sanctuary when the bully is in the palm of your hand, along with the other apps you use daily to work, socialize, and stay connected. I know this is an issue that concerns all parents, and from the work of my own daughter, who's 15, it's an issue that frightens young teenagers as well. The echo chambers of social media have also created spaces where extremism, radicalization, and conspiracy can thrive. A research study conducted by Facebook in Germany in 2016 showed that 60% of people who joined groups that shared extremist content did so with the active recommendation of the platform. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Center for Countering Digital Hate published a report called the Disinformation Dozen, which showed that just 12 people were responsible for 65% of the anti-vax disinformation that was circulating on social media, driven by the platform's recommendation tools. So before we consider how we should establish higher safety standards for social media, we must recognize that we are regulating the systems that drive those platforms, not just the content placed on them. For this reason, whilst the design of these systems can in some circumstances cause harm, the response cannot just be greater user awareness and media literacy training. The platforms themselves must be held responsible. To believe this doesn't make you anti-tech, any more than requiring seatbelts in cars makes you anti-car. How then will the Online Safety Bill in the UK address these issues for the companies that serve users who are based there? Our approach starts with recognising the liability of the platforms and the responsibility they have both to uphold the law as well as the promises they make to their users. It also requires platforms to be proactive in identifying and mitigating illegal activity, as well as behaviour that is in breach of their community standards. They cannot just wait to act on user referral or treat users' complaints on a case-by-case basis without considering other examples of the same information displayed in the same context and with the same meaning elsewhere on their platform. Nor can they have an excuse that they have simply failed to monitor content that has met the threshold for mitigation, especially if it has already been recommended to others. Content on Facebook newsfeed, next up on YouTube, or For You on TikTok must have already been monitored by the platform in order for it to be recommended. The Online Safety Bill sets our priority illegal harms, written on the face of the legislation, including not just child sexual exploitation and terrorist content, but other offences like inciting violence, harassment, race hate and fraud. It also creates new offences for cyberflashing, the deliberate targeting of people suffering with epilepsy with flashing images, and promoting self-harm and suicide. With all these offences, the platforms will have to demonstrate to the regulator, Ofcom, and through codes of practice, how they will identify and mitigate this content. This will require them to establish whether or not they believe content on their platform has reasonably met the criminal threshold, and then take action to remove and/or mitigate it. There are some people who say that this will require platforms to preempt the law and make content moderation decisions based on their interpretation of it. However, this already happens through the enforcement of the platform's community policies. What we are saying, though, is that the minimum safety standards must be based on our laws, not just policies written in Silicon Valley. For users, I believe that freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach, an idea that now appears that Elon Musk is embracing at Twitter, where he has promised to demonetize and not promote tweets containing hate speech or otherwise what he calls negative content. We all know there has always been a tension between freedom of speech rights and the harm that speech can cause others. Social media platforms should not be promoting speech that incites violence, race hate, and other criminal activity. Whilst people have a right to express unpopular and controversial opinions, they do not have a right to have their views amplified to millions of people on social media, any more than they have a right to be broadcast on television and radio or printed in someone else's newspaper. Online platforms will also be required to remove networks of accounts where it has been clearly shown that they are being used by a hostile foreign state to spread disinformation. The Online Safety Bill, though, does respect the right of media organisations to reach audiences through social media platforms without those platforms effectively becoming their editor-in-chief. Recognised media companies, where named individuals are legally responsible for their content, will not be regulated under this system unless they are publishing material that is clearly illegal. Where a social media platform believes the content of that news organisation is in breach of their community policies, they will not be able to remove that content until after an appeal from the media company has been heard. The regulator Ofcom will also conduct risk assessments to see how effective platforms are enforcing their terms of service and ensure that those community standards are clearly set out to users. If a social media company claims that it doesn't tolerate hate speech, then Ofcom will have the power to investigate what they are doing to address it. Should companies fail to comply with requests from the regulator for information, then a named company director could face criminal sanctions. Overall, failure to work to meet the requirements set out in the Online Safety Bill could leave companies liable for fines of up to 10% of global annual revenues, a sum that for some companies would obviously run into billions of pounds. There are additional protections for children as well. Online platforms that host adult-only content must have systems in place to prevent under-18s from accessing it. This would apply for social media platforms that host adult content, as well as for commercial pornography platforms. Platforms will have to demonstrate to Ofcom how they can effectively enforce this. There will also be greater transparency around age assurance. If a social media app like Instagram or TikTok says that you have to be 13 years old to use their service, Ofcom will ask them to demonstrate how they enforce this rule, beyond self-certification from the user. This could be through using device-level settings, which can prove the age of the child, or other technologies like Yoti that help to identify younger and older users. Ofcom could also request evidence from platforms showing how old they believe their app users actually are. from data that they hold about their online activity or have acquired from their devices. The bill will also require platforms to offer more safety features for adults to opt into. This will mean that users could request not to see hate speech that neither meets the legal threshold for removal nor is in breach of platforms' community standards. The Online Safety Bill is in effect regulating the output of social media recommendation tools powered by artificial intelligence. AI is an enabling process, so we need to consider the inputs into those systems and whether they have been established along clear safety by design principles. In the UK, in addition to considering the regulation of the output of AI systems, we have established the AI Standards Hub, an initiative that has been funded by the government and is being led by the Alan Turing Institute in partnership with the British Standards Institution, the National Physical Laboratory, and supported by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and the Office for AI. The Hub's mission is to advance trustworthy and responsible AI with a focus on the role that standards can play as governance tools and innovation mechanisms. Product safety, cybersecurity, and resilience in non-AI context have been long established as important areas of standardization. The Hub will consider the role of established standards in these areas when it comes to the AI context. Trustworthy AI sets out to enable technologies and prevent misplaced trust, which can lead to harm. We are still in the early stages of understanding how to regulate and set standards for user-to-user services online. New technologies like the metaverse, which while still being in scope of the Online Safety Bill, will present new challenges on how to identify illegal activity in live virtual reality environments. We will need to continue to respond both to the challenges and the opportunities of our technological future. The passing of our current legislation is just the next stage in that journey. An effective partnership between governments, regulators, and the tech companies themselves is the best guarantee of success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Damian. Please join the panel. And now it's my greatest pleasure to introduce Justus, who is going to moderate the next panel. Please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be leading you through this first panel of the day, which is entitled The Digital Services Act, the Internet's Constitutional Moment, or just a minor update. And I would like to introduce the four distinguished panelists. So Catarina dos Santos, member of the Christian Democrat Party, a member of the German Parliament, and she's serving on the Committee for Digital Affairs, so please take a seat. We have David Wheeldon, who's head of EMEA, Government Affairs and Public Policy at YouTube. And we will be joined by Nikolaus von Peter, who will fill in for Prabhat Agarwal, who can't make it, unfortunately, today, but I'm sure you will be a worthy replacement. And of course, Damian Collins, who needs no further introduction after his keynote speech. Thank you very much for joining the panel and discussing this important topic with us. And maybe just a quick word about myself. So I'm Justus Dreiling. I used to work for Wikimedia, where I had to deal with the DSA quite extensively. Well, the Wikimedia is the host of another platform that is also targeted by the DSA, non-profit platform. And these days, I'm director of Comunia, an international NGO based in Brussels. So maybe let's go right into it. And my first question goes to Nikolaus. So we've heard a lot from the commissioner before the first draft of the DSA was published, and he said, you know, the DSA will end the Wild West on the internet. It will rein in big tech, and it will ensure that what is illegal offline is finally also illegal online. How is the DSA going to achieve this? Maybe you could paint this in a very abstract way.
Very abstract, I guess, because that's the DSA. It's, I mean, you've almost managed to read out the entire UK online bill. I would not try now to read out the DSA, which already has something like 370 pages. Okay, what's on page 15, please? Okay, so it's really, I mean, that's the second gift. That's the second reason to wear these trousers, because I think personally, as Nikolaus von Peter, it's really a gift. Not all legislation of the European Union is wonderful, one could say, but this one is really very comprehensive. And I think what is important is that it is, at the one hand, very clear in what it requires from platforms. I mean, from what we call providers of intermediary services. That's a technical term. And that it covers basically a wide range of these services, all that we would like to see in scope, whereas at the moment we have specific rules for specific problems, for specific providers. Yeah? So we're going to have in the future for all providers that we consider important and for all types of services and for all types of issues we think today are important or are problematic or are relevant, we're going to have a solution. And that's important, the rule is also, I mean, the rules are adaptive in the sense that they are, at least for the very large online platforms, the platforms with more than equal or more than 45 million users, recipients of services, there's going to be a clause that requires them to observe duties of care and to basically monitor and mitigate risks. And with that clause, we're going to capture a lot of emerging problems. And Prabhat, who's not here unfortunately today, he's often referring to a communication we adopted in 2016 on online platforms. And if you read that communication, which is just 6 years old, the word disinformation doesn't figure once in that communication. Not once, it's only 6 years ago, okay? So we see that there are issues that we, ideally we would basically, we are basically capturing them with the rules that we have in place today, because it's always an issue to be basically to keep pace with innovation, yeah, and not to stall it at the same time. So you cannot predict everything. You don't want to restrict everything. So we have now a set of rules which is, we believe, all-encompassing for the current issues, for the current providers, but also for future issues. And it's one set of rules for the entire internal market. So that's very important as well, so that businesses can develop, businesses like yours, but also businesses that are basically being created today, and that are not running into this fragmentation of rules that we are seeing at the moment, or we have seen up till now, because we've had already some important rules or laws adopted, the Netz-DG, many of you know, I guess, and which was a very important predecessor, or still is at the moment. And we've had this time of learning and of inspiration, but it's now time to have one set of rules for the entire European Union for all companies, which we consider to be in the scope, and not just a subset of issues, but all important issues.
Thank you very much for this general overview of the DSA's provisions, and with that, I would turn to Caterina dos Santos. As a German lawmaker who's followed the bill probably very closely over the last couple of months, are you satisfied with the outcome, or is there an area where you would have liked to see some improvement, or a different approach, maybe a bit more in the direction of the UK online safety bill that we've just heard, or the floor is yours.
Good morning also from my side. It's a pleasure to be able to discuss with you today. I think it's quite remarkable what you also said, that when we think about law in digital terms, often we have the discussion that we're always only reacting to innovation and always reacting to developments that are way ahead of political movement sometimes. Or at least it's a discussion. And I think with the DSA we have really also a new approach to try to conclude also these innovation or possible innovations also in the next years, so that we don't have to amend this law every year maybe, and we try really to do like it's like an overview to what could possibly happen, and that we really cover some possible changes that are also done in innovation. And we live in times of big disinformation. We live in very digital times, and of course there's always something you can improve. And of course we also have to think about law enforcement when we think of disinformation. And also a little surprise, social media is used cross borders, even if sometimes we only think we can deal with it on a very national way. And it's so important that it's a European law, that is also suitable for every country of the EU, and that we try to deal with this from this situation. And I think the DSA will be a badly needed improvement on this topic, and also in the terms of law enforcement cross borders. So sure, there are always points when we think maybe about we can think about so many things, but think about protection of data, protection of minors, protection from disinformation, that we have really to think about all these topics. And I think the DSA is a good overview of this.
Thank you very much. So basically the DSA essentially preserves the conditional liability exception in Europe. It is more of a procedural than a substantial approach to platform regulation. From YouTube's perspective, the DSA has now entered into force on November 16th. How has your life changed since then? Or how do you expect your life to change in the next coming months?
My life personally? Actually for YouTube, it is not as substantive change as maybe the outside world might think, because many of the provisions in the DSA we have been doing for a long period of time. So when we look at the way we treat illegal content, which we respect in each of the member states that we operate, or our community guidelines, which is about our enforcement of our policies, many of the provisions in the DSA around transparency, around the application of the policies, we are already doing. And actually, I think to that extent, we welcome it. And we also welcome the fact that the DSA does enshrine some very important European principles in getting the balance between protection and freedom of expression. So and in contrast perhaps to the online safety bill, and maybe we can debate this with Damian later, which doesn't enshrine prohibition against general monitoring, the DSA does do that. And I think that's actually to be welcome, because the truth of the matter is that automated systems aren't always effective, and they can err on the side of over-removal as well as failure to spot things. And one of the approaches that we take in the way that we look at our content moderation duties is we don't just rely on automated systems. We obviously use those automated systems to spot the vast range of content that's on YouTube, 500 hours, including this session, by the way, get uploaded every hour. And the last quarter, we removed over 5.5 million videos. So you can't do that just by a human. But what you can do is use humans to train the algorithm, to help it spot the patterns. The algorithm is great at spotting patterns, but humans need to set the policies. And we've always taken that approach. And we're transparent. So transparency is at the core of the way that we approach the application of our community guidelines. Every quarter we publish our transparency report. And within that, this year we started publishing the reasons that we remove content, including, by the way, misinformation. So you can see what we're removing for the reasons of misinformation, which we think is really important. And so I think the DSA, it's a really important moment. I'm not underplaying it at all. But for us as a platform, it's not going to lead to absolutely fundamental changes. It may be for others, and to your point, it's a common set of rules, so it will apply to everybody, and that is a good thing. Although I think one of the areas where the online safety bill does a little bit better is the online safety bill has this assessment of risk, because what we see increasingly is the risk is migrating to smaller platforms that may not be caught under the rules of the DSA. And that, I think, is a problem for society and for users. And the online safety bill is a little bit better in addressing that. I personally think it's a really good thing to have two slightly different approaches, and we can learn what works. However, Katerina, I was really pleased to hear that we're not going to update this every year, because you know what? I think we all need a little bit of a rest, and we need to wait for these very complex and novel pieces of legislation to bed in and to see how they work, where they work well, before we start to rewrite them.
Thank you very much for those of you who also had the pleasure of following 3,000 pages of amendment proposals. I think we can all agree that we don't want a renewal of the DSA every year. With that being said, Damian Collins, so you've hinted a little bit at the differences in approaches maybe between the European Union's the Digital Services Act and the UK Online Safety Bill. But maybe you could be a bit more explicit from your perspective. What are some of the distinct advantages of the current draft of the UK Online Safety Bill vis-à-vis the DSA?
Yeah, sure. Now, I mean, just to say, in general terms, I absolutely agree with what David said at the end there, that having two different approaches in close proximity might end up being helpful. Because I think what will happen, I think this will happen in Europe, I think this will happen around the world as well, is that in the UK, if there are things that the DSA does which work really well, and we think work better than the Online Safety Bill, what you'll probably see is an amendment to say, well, let's do that, because that looks good. In the same way, I would think that policymakers in Europe will look at the Online Safety Bill and think, if that is delivering in other areas better outcomes and results, then people will say, well, let's do some of that. I think we will see a general leveling up of standards around the world as different countries try different things. I mean, we've seen this with the Australian News Bargaining Code, which is now being adopted in Canada and will be in the UK and in other countries as well. So I think that will happen. So on the differences, I think there are some quite important differences. And I wasn't surprised to hear David Wilden say that in many ways YouTube thought it was already sort of compliant with the DSA. Because I think there is a slight danger that the DSA has sort of legislated for the status quo. The priority illegal areas of harm remain as they were under the e-commerce directive, which is child sexual exploitation and terrorist content. And then the general duty of care. Now, we had quite a big debate in the UK around the duty of care principle in the Online Safety Bill. And we moved away from it, not because we don't think there should be a general duty of care, but when you looked at it, I think you need to be more specific to the platforms about what you mean. So instead of having a general duty of care, we looked instead at writing across onto the face of the legislation different areas of the criminal law that we should apply. So, inciting racial hatred is a criminal offence in the UK. We had an example after the final of the, I don't want to talk about football this morning, but after the final of the European Championships last year where England lost to Italy, a number of the Black England players were targets of racial abuse. Now, people have been, on Twitter in particular, people have been prosecuted for what they posted. So we've got an offence in law, we understand how it works, we know what the criminal threshold is. So what we're saying there is we want the regulatory system the companies follow to be at least as good at as that. Now, most companies probably set standards that are higher still than that, but the baseline should at least be what we recognise as where the criminal law sits. And so what we've done is read across onto the face of the bill areas of law where we want that to apply, and where there are gaps around things like promoting self-harm and suicide, to actually create new offences in law, which Parliament has to do, and then read those across onto the face of the bill. Now, I think that has the advantage for the companies of them, and these are called priority legal offences, so we've selected the things that we think are worst, and it gives clarity to the companies because they understand what things that we want them to prioritise. The other key aspect as well, and this touches on the point getting onto general monitoring that David talked about, is the proactive nature of it. It's not enough for the platforms to say we have policies in place, and if people complain that they've seen this content and they should have done, that we're efficient in processing those complaints. This is to say what the regulator expects is you should be proactively eliminating this content at the regulatory standard or enforcing your own terms of service to do it. And we will monitor you to make sure how good your systems are. Now, this is systems-based regulation, as I talked about in my remarks, so we don't expect that means that every time a company fails to stop a piece of content that should have been moderated, it gets fined. It's to say, in the round, how effective are their systems at doing this? Have they can they demonstrate to us the design of those systems and how they work? And then if the systems are working well, then we'd expect them to capture most of what they're looking for. And if the systems are working badly, the regulator will work with the companies to get improvement. If the companies won't improve, then that's where they get fined. If they won't cooperate with the investigation, then they can face criminal sanctions. so the proactive nature of the online safety bill, I think, is a really important and necessary distinction. The other thing is in terms of moderating. Now, I know there's a lot of requirements in the DSA for independent researchers to have access to data and information from the platforms. In the UK, a lot of people say, why can't we have that in the online safety bill as well? What we have, though, is a statutory regulator with legal powers to request. My slight concern with the DSA might be that if independent research organisations can request information, what power do they have to know whether what they're getting back is the whole story? And I think the Ofcom will have that legal power to request, because if we take transparency reporting as an example, as David's here, I'll use Facebook as the example for this, but I don't think YouTube is that different. Facebook produce transparency reports, and so one of the things they often say in their transparency reports, 95% of the hate speech we remove is detected by our AI systems rather than user complaint. So how much do they actually remove? 95% of what they remove is removed by the system. Now, when Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, went public, she said Facebook engineers believed their systems only remove about 5% of the hate speech that's on the platform. So the transparency report is saying there that we remove 95% of the 5% that gets removed, our systems pick up. But what about the rest? Now, when you ask this question of the companies directly, they fail to provide an answer to it. I don't think because they don't know the answer. It's just because they don't know what to say in response to it. So we have to, if we want to have proper transparency reporting, we have to move away from this world where we don't actually know what's going on. We're reliant on the companies telling us they have effective systems, but no one knows how effective those systems actually are. It could be the AI is not as good as they say it is. It could be it needs more human moderation being built into it, or it needs more fire breaks in the system to slow down bad content. Just finally, on general monitoring, I think the reason we haven't got a general monitoring provision in there, we're starting from the basis that we're creating this legislation outside of EU law, so we had the freedom not to, is that what I don't want this to be is a big get out of jail for the platforms, where they say, okay, this is bad stuff, we should have regulated, we should have got rid of it, it's a breach of the criminal standards, it's a breach of our platform policies, but there's no general provision we have to monitor everything, so we missed that one. So we'll deal with it afterwards. And what you don't want is this legal loophole where you say, actually, there is no proactive responsibility because there's no requirement to generally monitor. Now, I think a regulator can work with the companies to determine what they expect in that regard. And for me, that would be, as I said in my remarks, if a platform has promoted a piece of content to another user, then it has de facto been monitored. Their system has decided that this person will like this, and therefore we're going to recommend it to you. And if that act of recommendation is pushing content that's in breach of platform policies or breach of a criminal standard, or certainly fails the duty of care test under the DSA, then the company should be responsible for that. They can't. Now, I don't think that means that a company should equally be, if someone has posted a film on YouTube on a channel with 10 subscribers that 6 people have seen, I wouldn't expect the regulator to say, well, that's clearly a problem, because it's hard to find. You probably have to specifically search for it. It's not been recommended. YouTube will probably get to that eventually and do something about it. And the number of people that have seen it is very small. But there should be, I think, a general presumption that if the platforms are actively pushing content at people, that they've already monitored it, they're responsible for it, and they should be regulated on that basis.
Thank you very much. So I think we have the unfortunate situation that Katarina will need to leave us in a minute, basically, to take place in a vote on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate. So maybe you have the time for a final statement. I would be very interested if you have a very short remark on this, on the enforcement of the DSA, because I think that's a big question from a national perspective. So. Last time. On
a very short note, no, I'm very sorry that I will have to leave soon, but Parliament is calling me. So for me, enforcement, what I'm mattering most with now is the role of the coordinator now and how it's been settled in Germany. We are discussing this like months. Outside this bubble, maybe no one sees this discussion, but in German Parliament, it's a very big discussion. So what's the question? The question is, who is going to be the coordinator? Do we have an argument with the Bundesländer in Germany? Do we have an argument between the different ministries in Germany? Who is it going to be? What is the role? What is he doing? Is it a person? Is it a collective? Who is doing what? So we're basically arguing about everything. What I think is important is that the coordinator is really also a coordinated voice of the German interests, also in the discussion with the Commission, for example. So we have now a paper from the Ministry of Digitalization who says that the Bundesnetzagentur should be the coordinator, or is a suitable coordinator. I think we have to see in a very realistic view, it is difficult to build a whole new ministry or like a whole new function for this, because it costs money, it is difficult to set it up and stuff like this. So I would have loved to have one coordinated view who really coordinates also the opinions from the 16 Bundesländer and then coordinates to one opinion, one German opinion, and also has a much easier way to work with this, because now I think it's very differentiated or very difficult to coordinate this in a German view. How will this happen? I still don't know what they're going to do, but I think it's the next discussion that we're going to face, and it's crucial that we come to really one similar and joint point to be able to also enforce the DSA on a German level. So very sorry that I will have to leave you now, but if you have another questions, you can email me on every social media too. And then thank you so much and have a good discussion.
Thank you very much for making it here. And I'm very sorry, because David actually wanted to follow up on a point made by Damian. So please, you wanted to react to Damian's point.
Thank you, Katarina. Good luck with your voting. Yeah, so I think Damian did make an important point there about the efficacy of removal policies in particular. And actually, I think we're probably in very much alignment here. One of the things that we've done at YouTube for some time now is that we publish a violative view rate. So that's essentially the number of times per 10,000 views that violative content is viewed on the platform. And so for every 10,000 views on YouTube, between 10 and 11 violate our policies. And I think that's really important, because that tells you, because to your point, you know, a video that gets that is viewed many times over a short period is going to be of more concern than one that gets very, very few views over a long period. So that violative view rate is an important measure of the success that we have in ensuring that content is removed before it gets widely distributed and widely seen. And that number has fallen every time we published it. So that's really important. I do think, though, that on the sort of point about general monitoring, one of the other good things that the DSA does is it actually creates greater incentives on platforms to find illegal content and not to be penalized for so doing, which is an important balance here. And I think those sort of fundamental rights within the EU legislative framework are quite a sensible way to go. Having said that, Damian's point about the OSB enshrining that regulatory dialogue is, I think, also a very useful and important point. And that regulatory dialogue with Ofcom, which is a very experienced regulator, I think is going to make some difference. And declaration here, I worked in the broadcast media for 15 years. I've worked with Ofcom for a long time, and I know how sensible it is about these things, and how actually it prioritizes getting to the right outcome rather than a particular legalistic process. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the DSA works in that context, because with the exception of the codes of practice, which are also part of the DSA, it doesn't enshrine that cooperative approach, and that could be a challenge.
To reply to your remarks, because I have also a slightly different view on a few points, and one is that you said that the DSA is mainly regulating the status quo, but I think that's, at least as regards the very large online platforms, that's not entirely true, because we have a clause on risk assessment and risk mitigation, which is sufficiently wide to capture any kind of future issue with fundamental rights. And so it's not basically saying, I mean, it's also mentioning disinformation and other problems, but it's also simply asking platforms to monitor and systemic risks, and then mentions some of them. And one of them is danger to certain fundamental rights. So you have two levels of generality where you basically could fit different issues under. That's the first point. So I don't believe that this is not future-proof. And secondly, when it comes to the accountability that's been created for, for platforms in the future, through there are many different instruments to hold, make sure that platforms are being held accountable. Either through this monitoring, to the independent auditing that they have to undergo every year, but also through other things like the data access for scientists. I mean, it's not the case that authorities have not the same leverage or the same powers. There's a very long section on powers of the digital service coordinators, and if you read it, it reads like basically rights of an investigative body like a public prosecutor or something like the competition authority of the European Commission. Basically, they can start a raid on a company. They have all kind of powers to ask companies for their cooperation, to get information. It's really very what they can do is extremely invasive in a way, and we think it's important that they have these powers well regulated, hedged, and well balanced with the fundamental rights, because we are, you've described the situation perfectly well in the beginning, that this is not just about digital platforms, it's really an issue which is there for society as a whole and for democracy. So I think it's important to vest authorities, not only data scientists, with these powers, and the Digital Services Act does so. And last point, sorry, because you said that small and medium-sized enterprises are not within the scope. I mean, it's true within a certain type of obligations. They're not applying. Notably, the ones that I just mentioned: the risk assessment and risk mitigation. But there's a whole set of rules applying also to smaller companies. So we think it's proportionate to their basically to the risks they create and to the resources they have.
Can I just
of course, yeah.
So I'm pleased to hear what you say about the investigatory powers, because I think that was my sort of question really, was whether there would be the kind of, if needed, the legal authority to go in and if you're saying that there will be there, then that's good to hear, and that's very important. I suppose my other thing question is that I think the challenge is to make sure that the system is proactive rather than reactive, because otherwise I think we're in a position where we're just trying to work out whether the platforms are basically enforcing their terms of service, apart from on the worst stuff. And I think it does need to be proactive. I think to achieve the step change that we want, their obligations need to be proactive, not just dealing with user complaint as it comes in, which I think is key. And that's my only other question would be on the fundamental rights question is to make sure that it's always sort of understood enough from the companies what their obligations are to meet those objectives, and that the concern we had with the online safety bill was even if principle based, the more general you make it, the greater the chance the companies might come back and say, oh, but that wasn't really specifically said that had to be addressed up front, and that doesn't create a sort of legal loophole of definition, the debate on definitions.
That's why it's important to create these duties these obligations of procedure, that basically you oblige companies to proceed in a certain manner. And for instance, to have this risk assessment, which is then subject to an independent auditor, and report every year by the companies, and also by the digital service coordinators, which are gathering in that central body at the European Union level, where you have every year a report about the systemic risks that have been reported to the European Commission, which are common to the different platforms, and that we have these codes of conduct and standards that have been drafted by industry and by the Commission to share best practices It's all proactive. I mean, risk assessment is proactive, and then we have this sharing of knowledge of what works, what are the recurrent problems, and what kind of instruments are being basically accepted to mitigate these problems, in particular with a view to respective fundamental rights.
Okay.
For those who don't follow content moderation debates and platform regulation debates as closely as all the members of this panel, I think this is a very interesting point in the debate, because basically it is about finding the right balance between protecting users from illegal content on the one hand, and on the other hand, ensuring that users can make use of their fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, right? Because I think if you define the responsibilities of platforms in a very proactive way, that means that platforms carry the risk of being liable for content they hold. And I think one of the criticisms from civil society on the UK online safety bill is that some of those categories aren't as clearly defined as they should be, maybe. So, I mean, illegal content, you said, is modeled around criminal code. That wouldn't be possible in Europe, of course, because every member state has their own criminal laws. But then you also mentioned some responsibilities for content that is not necessarily illegal. And I think I would like to discuss this a little bit, because it's obviously tricky, right? It might lead to overblocking of content, of perfectly legal content, right? And yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your approach there.
Sure. I mean, the debate in the UK. This is what we call legal but harmful. And in America, they call it, I think,
awful but lawful.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think actually this has been has created an area of confusion around the bill, because what the bill really does is it works on the basis that there are legal standards that we want the companies to meet, and to create and to read across legislation that's not just the worst kind of content which is already dealt with in law on child sexual exploitation and terrorist content, but other offences in law that we want to read across. And really, as I said earlier on, what we're saying there is that we want the regulatory standard to be where the criminal law standard is as a minimum. So if a platform has very weak platform community standards and policies, that we can still say, well, okay, you can't just not have a policy on race hate. You know, we're saying what you've got to do is apply at least the kind of where the legal threshold is. And through the codes of practice, we will determine what we think that looks like and where we think that is. For most platforms, like YouTube, their community standards will probably be much higher than the legal threshold, and they will have standards on hate speech which are below the legal threshold, and it's their community, it's their space, their right to have that. And what we want them to do is be really clear about what those policies are and be clear that they're enforcing them. We have already a system where legal speech is being removed by platforms because by their interpretation, it's a breach of their platform policies. That's happening all the time. So what the online safety bill does is it says that there should be at least a minimum safety threshold, which is where the criminal law is. And in most cases, for most of this, if the platforms enforce their own policies consistently, proactively, and effectively, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. The fact we're looking to create these legal frameworks around it, this regulatory framework around it, is because we don't believe they're doing it in a way that we want them to, and there may be some things which they're not prepared, some platforms aren't prepared to moderate, which we think that they should. So that the bill creates no legal requirement for companies to remove lawful speech. What it does do is provide regulatory scrutiny of how they do it, and sets minimum safety standards to make sure at least the criminal standard is being met. And I think that is the right balance to strike. I mean, the debate in the UK around legal but harmful was really over risk assessing categories of harmful speech to see how companies dealt with them. We've moved away from that now to say what we'll do instead is we will just risk assess the terms of service the platform set and see whether they're meeting those properly or not.
Thank you very much. Nikolaus, I think it's interesting because the DSA is a horizontal approach. You mentioned that it applies to all online platforms essentially, but then there are some special provisions for what is called very large online platforms that have at least 10% of the EU's population as users. The rationale is, of course, platforms that have this kind of reach should carry more responsibilities than other platforms. And there, I think we see some attempts to maybe regulate content that is not just strictly illegal, but also more harmful. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on those provisions?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I already mentioned this several times because it's such an important provision, and also is I think, an innovative approach to regulating platforms, and guarantees this future-proofness, that we have this provision that asks very large online platforms to assess risks, systemic risks, and then act accordingly. And as you said, we mentioned there are also issues which are not basically illegal content, but which we consider still to be harmful or problematic for fundamental rights. Yeah? So negative effects for fundamental rights, including freedom of expression, data protection, privacy, or on other societal concerns like public health, security, civic discourse, electoral processes. I mean, this is responding to developments we have been now seeing over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years in particular. And it was an important moment for the Commission. You know, most of you probably know Commissioner Breton, and his Twitter account is, I think, worth following because the person running it is quite witty. Only yesterday did he basically report on a call with Elon Musk, and the readout was basically published on Mastodon. Yeah? So, and it was a real invitation to him when last year, I think it was last year, briefly after the Congress was basically being assaulted by, I think it was still a president by then, Trump. I mean, the immediate direction was that this won't happen in Europe because we're going to have the DSA very soon. So this is what happened was not illegal content being basically being shared online, but it was inside it. I mean, it was basically things that we consider equally harmful or dangerous, and still they're not enshrined somewhere in the penal code in member states. So we think that it's important that the platforms are acting upon this kind of. I mean, they're making sure that their systems are not somehow. It's all about amplification, basically. No, it's about the incentives these systems create, which mainly comes from advertisement. But now we are in a realm which is not about products any longer, but it's about free speech. It's about public discourse. I mean, you have a very, very important role, YouTube, and you know it. And it's great that we have these kind of platforms for exchange, but so we need commensurate strategies to basically make sure that we don't have these unwanted effects. And so this is the core of that provision, Article 27, I think. Yes, which is really worth reading because it's very interesting, and then perhaps because that's the other side of the coin, we have the risk assessment, then we have the risk mitigation. And there basically go to the core of how platforms work. So you could basically mitigate risks by adapting content moderation or recommender systems, by limiting display of advertisements, in certain cases, by reinforcing internal processes or supervision, by cooperating with trusted flaggers. These are people or organizations which have been selected because they fulfill certain criteria, and their notices are being treated with priority, and then, as I mentioned before, we have these codes of conduct and standards that also are references for these kind of actions.
I see David moving around in his chair, and I think he wants to reply to your points.
No, I guess I want a bit of clarification and maybe a bit of a defence for recommendations, because I've heard from Damian and from you, Peter, that you know we need to view recommendations as part of the problem, and they need to be dealt with, and that somehow the incentives around recommendations lead to bad outcomes. And I'm not sure that's entirely right. Recommendations are a really important way of ensuring that people, particularly on YouTube, get to see the content that they like and they love. Without recommendations, we wouldn't know, we wouldn't know your age, we wouldn't know where you lived, but importantly, we wouldn't know what you like. And we use the signals that we get from 80 billion different inputs a day to tell us what content you like and what content is actually of high quality. So, for example, one of the inputs is a video watched all the way to the end? Because if it's watched all the way to the end, that would be an indication that it's actually high quality than one that people click away from after a few seconds. These are important signals. But more than that, you need to have these signals for recommendations in order to address some of the online safety challenges. And indeed to ensure that the content that people see is content that is not causing societal harms, or indeed is helping to achieve societal aims. So at YouTube we have a thing called the 4 Rs, which is our way of thinking about content moderation. So we remove content, the first R, that breaches our policies. We raise up authoritative content. So we take signals about what's authoritative and we ensure that that is recommended to our users. We reduce, or rather we don't allow borderline content that might breach our policies into those recommendation systems. And then we reward creators who actually produce high-quality content, who are eligible to enter our partnership program, and who ultimately benefit from more than 50% of the revenues that we generate. And all of that depends upon recommendation systems. So they do really good things. Of course, we need to be transparent. And I think that's absolutely key, and it's something that we've been stepping into over many years at YouTube. And it's something I think the DSA is absolutely right about, and it's important that we are. Having said that, we do need to be slightly careful, because what we don't want to do, there are bad actors out there, by the way, on the internet, and they like information. So when we are alerting people to the reasons for removal of content, for example, what we don't want to do is to be so transparent that we give the bad actors more information to use against us. That's something that I think we got to think about in the context of the DSA, because it is actually quite prescriptive in that sense. But by and large, I think we are all on the same page. But I did have to, and I was listening to Damian's comments about recommendations, I did have to make a bit of a defense of them, because I do think that sometimes they're characterized in a way that this is all about exploitation, this is all about financial incentives. It's not about that entirely. It's about creating platforms that users can enjoy and can access the content that they love as well, and also about addressing harms, and we should remember that.
Well, I mean, just to say, I mean, YouTube's an advertising business, you know. Therefore, it's about audience the recommendation tools are there to support audience acquisition and retention. I mean, that's so, and 70% of what people watch on YouTube is selected for them through features like Next Up. So it's not like a sort of a side product. It's kind of core to the way the whole thing works. And so, you know, it is there for commercial reasons, because if it's the core thing that drives an advertising business, then obviously its purpose is commercial. There's nothing wrong with it, though. I mean, you can imagine, it's really, in the hands of someone who says, you know, you like this music from this artist, well, the chances are if you like that artist, you might like this one you've not yet discovered, and therefore YouTube recommending that is a good thing, you know. But I suppose what we're both getting at from both the DSA and the online safety bill is to say, if you're saying that you use this tool in a sensible way, and that you can actually use the recommendation to steer people towards, you know, authoritative and high quality content away from bad content, that's great. But we want to know whether this is really the case, you know. And therefore we've, you know, created these powers to do that. And we know that these recommendation tools, you know, can be adjusted all the time. They're pulling in data from across the platform. So I think the question for the regulators is going to be, are you sometimes pulling in data that is not really very responsible to use? If you've got someone who's taken an interest, if you've got a teenage girl who's interested in healthy eating, and yet they suddenly start to get pushed at them content around really extreme anorexia, you know, as people, then that is a really bad thing, and the system should be moderating that. And I mean, this is a Facebook example, but the Facebook example from the presidential election in 2020, I think also shows the power that you have over, the companies have over these systems, whereby because of the fear of disinformation up to polling day, they chose to more highly ranked trusted news sources than what they call civic groups, which was seen as much more problematic in terms of disinformation, had a big reduction in disinformation around polling day, also dropped engagement in the platform, So disinformation turned out is good for business. But then after the election, they reversed that, and then we saw some of the pressures building up to the 6th of January as well. So to me, that sort of story shows that actually there are all sorts of decisions companies can make about what data they prioritize and what they pull in that will change the way the recommendation systems work. And I think really what we're saying is that companies will be regulated on the decisions that they make and the outcomes that they achieve.
I think that's quite an important point, because obviously the problem is not so much recommendation, but the amplification of problematic content, and then also the recommendation maybe of advertisement that might be of dubious nature, to put it mildly. And I think my civil society colleagues had a lot of criticism about the DSA not tackling the business model per se as much as maybe would be needed. But maybe to put that question a bit differently for you, I mean, when I was still working at Wikimedia, we were thinking about, whether we would be considered a very large online platform. We were quite certain that we were, because the definition is passive users, not registered users. YouTube almost certainly will be considered a very large online platform. I think it's quite obvious. Is it clear for you what kind of responsibilities this will create? Because for me, when I read the provisions, it wasn't. Some of the provisions are still quite abstract, and I'm still not entirely sure how they're going to be implemented. So will this fundamentally change some of your approaches to this, to risk mitigation? I think is the most interesting one. Or will it essentially remain the same?
I mean, we will obviously be compliant with the DSA and with each of the stages of its implementation through the risk assessment and the transparency reports. I'm not sure I recognise your description of sort of that uncertainty. Yes, there are some uncertain elements to it, which I think we're all seeking for some reassurance from the Commission on. But I think we have a fairly clear sense of what our obligations are going to be under the DSA. I think the important thing to remember about the way that the DSA operates is it is, and we've said this on the panel, it's systematic. So it's not seeking to regulate individual pieces of content. It just couldn't do that. It's looking at company systems and procedures and the way in which we are transparent and publish what we're doing. From a YouTube point of view, I think we're quite comfortable with that, because we do, as I've said, we already do quite a lot of it. And I think we feel that the DSA has struck a decent balance there. I think there are some elements that we were quite vocal during the final stages about some of the effects that could happen from publishing every decision that's made around removals and deranking, because you are essentially giving a database to those that might wish to manipulate the platform. But we have pretty strong systems in place to prevent that kind of manipulation, and we're certainly ready for it. And so I think this is going to be an iterative process. Both the DSA and the OSB will be. We need to take our time to work out how to implement, but more importantly, what the effect of the implementation is. And on both provisions, I hope that we're able to do that in a sensible way through dialogue and take a step back at the appropriate juncture. So yeah.
Thank you. I have another question maybe for you, Damian. One point that you emphasized in your keynote was the protection of minors as a rationale for this bill. And I think that's also one point where I've seen a lot of criticism, not on the goal, of course. I think we all agree that we need to protect children better online. But for example, on verification procedures, age verification procedures. Some of the criticism stems from the fact that it's very hard to do, very hard to implement, and also, you will then have another kind of trove of data, database of minors, basically, which might also cause some risks. What is your perspective on these points?
Sure. So there are two levels of age restriction. So there is age restriction at if you're like 18. To say if you're a platform which hosts adult content, then you should have a way of protecting children from accessing that content on your platform. Now YouTube would say, well, we don't allow pornography on our platform. So therefore, it may well be that we don't need to do that because our systems are very effective at detecting that sort of adult content, and we remove it really quickly. So, but you could be a platform like Twitter, which does allow adult content, where you might say, well, okay, you need to build in some sort of system whereby you can age verify whether someone is 18 or over. Now, it's much easier to ask people who are 18 and over, who are adults, to provide ID and information that enables you to prove their age. It's harder with children because children don't have the same sort of ID, and parents are often concerned about that sort of information being shared. But there are things you could do. So if, for example, if a child's device has been set up by their parents, say it's an Apple device and they've got an Apple ID, and the parent has set the age of the child, which tells you the age of the person using the device, does a platform always ensure that it picks up that information and will block the creation of an account for someone who's under 13? Or do they not? Or do they choose not to? So that you could ask them on that basis. One of the things that's included in the Online Safety Bill was an idea that Frances Haugen published as well, was to say Ofcom could produce transparency reports on the age of users of the app. So if a platform has got data that shows quite clearly it's got 10% of its users are 10 or under, then why not publish that information? Why not challenge the companies to say, you're actually not enforcing the policy you've set yourself? Or maybe you could even come in under the system to say to companies, you should be using the information that you've readily got access to close the accounts of people who are under 13, but you're not doing it. So these are the sorts of things you could start to do. Or if your policy is to say, well, we want people over 10 can use our system, we think it's safe, then say that's what your policy is. What you shouldn't do is state a public policy that you don't enforce and rely on self-certification of users to say how old they are. There's been some research done in the UK showing that ads being targeted at people under 13 on the platform as well. I mean, data that they pull in probably from the user accounts of the friends of people, because they'll be pulling in the address book data of people setting up the accounts. That may well give, if someone's phone has got a very large number of people under 13 in their phone, it could be good grounds to believe that person is probably under 13 as well. So what we want within the regulatory system is for the regulator to have the power to have the conversations with these apps to say, okay, well, how do you assess what someone's age is, if they're 13 or not? What clues do you have after they've signed up? Do you pull in other device level data to help you make that decision?
Interesting, and I think it's worth noting that in the DSA there's also provision that prohibits the targeting of minors through advertising. Maybe to go in a bit of a different direction, we heard it in the beginning already, the discussion about having different regulatory frameworks now in the EU, in the UK, maybe also in the US. You mentioned a potential Section 230 reform at some point. And I think we know this discussion about regulatory arbitrage from different sectors, obviously not just online sector, but basically every industry. How is this going to affect the provision of services, basically? And maybe to start with Nikolaus, because I think one of the risks of fragmentation, regulatory fragmentation, might of course be that it will lead to a lot of geo-blocking of content, right? Because then maybe some content is not available in one country, it's available in another country, and then that leads to further fragmentation of the internet, which of course would be an unfortunate outcome, because I think the value of the internet is to have this global space, this global public square where everybody can communicate with each other. Do you think there will be a Brussels effect? Will the EU be the global rule setter on this, or do you think it will move in a direction where we will have to wait and see how the different approaches work together?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, perhaps this is more for you to reply to, David, because I guess it's part of your. I mean, as a company, you have a different type of forecasting going on, and you have, I mean, you have clients all over the world. We have clients in Europe only. So in the first place, we care about Europeans. And so all companies that basically deliver services to Europeans, they have to abide to the rules. Again, Commissioner Breton, who said in reply to Elon Musk's tweet, "The bird is free." He said, "If the bird flies in Europe, it flies to our rules." It's as simple as that. And I think our market is important enough for companies to really adapt to our rules. I mean, they simply have to at the moment, at least. I think there's still enough consumers in Europe for the years to come for these rules to be important enough, and to then perhaps change the company's behavior across the world. And I think in that respect, it's particularly important that we were, in a way, I mean, together with the UK, but we came rather early. I mean, we're still too late in a way because we've already seen many problems, but it was really important that the co-legislators managed to get this agreed within 2 years, which seems quite slow, but it's comparably quick. I mean, for the GDPR, we took, I think, 10 years from the very first day to the last day. And still it's considered to be, I mean, it's certainly a law which is perhaps not has not received the same kind of applause than the DSA, yeah. But it's also by many considered to be a standard, and we have now seen many jurisdictions who've either copied it or improved it, which is as good as copying it. I mean, it's even better. So with the DSA, the chances are even higher, I think, because we're quicker, that this could be a standard. But as you said, Damian, it's obviously of great advantage that you have similar systems running in parallel and that they can learn from each other, and that companies as well, like your company, are working under the two jurisdictions, and through the dialogues we're having, can tell the Commission, listen, what the UK is doing at the moment is very helpful. Why don't you do it as well?
Yeah, David, would you like to see the Brussels being the global regulator on this? Would you like the US to follow this model, or would you like to see more regulatory competition?
So I think every country is going, or jurisdiction will have its own approach. From a YouTube point of view, we're operating in 100 countries in 80 languages, over 2 billion monthly users, and it is important to us that we're able to apply our community guidelines consistently across the service. That makes them better. It also allows us to think through the challenges, use the information to improve, and it's a constant improvement process. And I at a sort of more fundamental level, I think bifurcation of the internet is not a good thing. I think the huge benefits that it's brought have been because it is global, because information is freely accessible. I think that's important in our liberal Western democracies, that we fight for that, and that we fight for the things that make our societies what they are. So I don't think that we are certainly not advocating for any particular model, but we would like to see approaches which allow a degree of consistency.
Maybe for a last statement, and Pancho gives me the nod to wrap this up quite soon. So,
well, I mean, firstly, as Nikolaus said, I think it's really important. I think it will be hugely beneficial if the different jurisdictions are sort of talking to each other about their experiences of doing it, and that we're learning from each other's experience. Because I think what we'll see is, without sort of consciously trying to create it, a degree of convergence between the different systems, because we will learn from best practice from each other, I think. And it's interesting in America even I had a meeting earlier in the year with some Republican and Democrat senators, and there, even though you see there around Section 230 reform is said, well, could we just, can we agree that the worst kind, that we should have better child protection standards, that things like fraud, which are, huge at scale criminal activity, which is costing governments and societies around the world enormous sums of money. Let's have some common standards on some of those things, and I think that will happen. Just as Nikolaus said, just as on GDPR, the UK is looking to change the data bill slightly, but it's not going to be a fundamental move away from GDPR. We're looking for global standards on trusted data free flow with trust, as they call it. We're seeing individual US states adopting legislation based on the GDPR model, just as the Californians also adopted legislation based on the UK's age-appropriate design code as well. So I think this will happen. I think in different countries around the world, if they see a regime in the UK or the EU or Australia that is working well, I think they will look to adopt that. So I think that will work, and that dialogue between ourselves, I think, will be important as well. We may find the platforms too say, well, actually, I mean, if they enforce, as I said earlier on, if the platforms enforce their own public terms of service consistently and effectively and dealt with AI recommendation as part of that moderation process as well, I think they'd find they're probably in compliance with most of the different regulatory regimes around the world. If they got their own policies right and effectively enforced, then I think they will be compliant, and that would be the easiest way of creating global standards.
Excellent. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we're coming back to our primary topic of our conference, data. And as we know, the Data Governance Act has a primary aim of implementing the European data strategy, and one of the basic aspects that the Data Governance Act would like to cover, that covers, are the data spaces. And I'm really happy that we have two concrete examples that we're going to discuss today. Firstly, we are going to focus on the European health data space, and the next panel will focus on the European data mobility data space. And it's my utmost pleasure to introduce Tomislav Sokol, member of the European Parliament from Croatia, from the Hrvatska Demokratska Zajednica, a Conservative Party, who is a rapporteur in the ENVI committee on this act. And Tomislav is with us in person. We really greatly appreciate your time. Dear Tomislav, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to make a presentation on the European health data space, which I think is really important. So this is really one of the first, or even the first, concrete initiative in terms of sectoral data spaces, and it's very good that it's in healthcare, because healthcare, is traditionally a national competence and has not been in the really focus of the European Union since before the pandemic. Now this has changed. European Union has shown us that there are many problems which member states cannot resolve by themselves. Hence, according to subsidiarity principle, European Union should also act. And one of these areas is health data, because currently the situation is that we have a very fragmented situation. We have 27 different national rules, 27 different national ways of implementing the GDPR as well. We have health data which cannot be used, cannot be exchanged, which is not interoperable, and this creates many problems, both for primary use of data, for instance, in cross-border healthcare, where patients cannot get access to their health, where medical professionals cannot get access to patients' data if patients are originally coming from another member state. So, for instance, cross-border workers, students, etc. But also, even more importantly, I think for secondary use of data in research, innovation, for real-world data, etc. And this is very important because, for instance, when we speak of real-world data in the real-world evidence in healthcare, it's becoming more and more important. For instance, with rare diseases, where you have where it's impossible because of small numbers of patients to conduct phase 3 clinical trials, real-world evidence is becoming more and more important. But for that, we need data, and currently this fragmented European system, non-standardized, non-interoperable, is really creating a problem. So the health data space regulation, which the Commission came up with the proposal in May, I think is a real game changer. I think it really is one of those few pieces of EU legislation which is not just technically improving some standards, etc., but actually creating something completely new. And I think this does not happen very often, and I think this is something that really needs to be emphasized, and this is why we need to get it done in this Parliament's and Commission's term in office, which means by the end by the beginning of 2024. When we speak of health data space, so of course, so we have two areas, main areas. One is primary use. So primary use of data means use by healthcare professionals, and this will be particularly important in the cases of cross-border healthcare. For instance, you are traveling to another member state, like I am now in Germany, or you are studying in another member state, you have to go to see a doctor, and then it will be possible, and the whole idea is that this medical professional in that member state can access your health data without having to go through, without having to repeat the diagnostics, treatments, and everything that has already been done in the other member states. So this will, the idea is that this will make the healthcare provision more effective, faster, and definitely better for the patients. But of course, there is also the secondary use of data. Secondary use of data, which I said is even more important for research innovation purposes. Here, I think, when we speak of the negotiations and the political dimension, there will be the biggest, I wouldn't say fights, but the biggest differences in opinion within the European Parliament. Because the crucial question is how, on one side, to facilitate the use of data, so to make it easier for this data to be used, and then, but also to protect privacy, to protect the personal information of the patients. And here, it will be crucial to find this balance. And if I may already say what my opinion is, the whole idea is that I plan, as the rapporteur of the European Parliament, as one of the two rapporteurs, because there is also co-lead rapporteur in the LIBE Committee on Civil Liberties, but my idea as the ENVI rapporteur is to actually endorse the Commission's main principles, which means that, for instance, when we speak of secondary use of data, of course, we need to protect patients' privacy, but it's impossible, if you want to make this work, to have individual consent in each single time where data should be used. So whenever somebody requests data for secondary purposes, it will be done in a secure environment, obviously. So it cannot be done by anybody from the street. But this system can only work in cases that we do not require every single time for every single request for use of data consent of every single patient. So that's something. If we will require that patients need to give consent in every single time, then the whole system will just not work. So this is, of course, there are different mechanisms how we can still preserve rights of the patients. For instance, maybe through an opt-out mechanism, etc. This is being discussed. But the idea is to really use this health data space regulation to make it easier to use data, not to create additional obstacles. Also, one of the major issues will be about definitions. We have a lot of what now this conference, as I understand it, discusses a lot of different legislative initiatives in the area of data. So what we will have to make sure that these different legislative packages fit together. So we will have to provide clear definitions in the regulation of the health data space, and also see how this fits in with the medical devices regulation, with AI Act, with Data Act, with GDPR as well. So this will be a really, I think, something that will take up most of our technical work to make these legal definitions fit together in the best possible way. Also, one thing which will be important for the implementation of health data space is funding. And I know this is something important for the member states, and I think that the Commission's proposal can be improved on that. So the Commission essentially is focusing the funding of the infrastructure and of this whole system on the existing funds, which are available mainly through the RRF. And I think this is not the best approach, because the RRF national plans were made before the health data space regulation was made. And of course, the big part of them is for digitalization, the biggest single part, but it's not necessarily focused on issues of digitalization on healthcare. Of course, in most member states, in most plans, you'll find something on that, but not earmarked funding for this type of infrastructure. So I think that we will have to provide stronger earmarked funding from EU level, from the centralized level on this, and this is something definitely that I will be fighting for. And the last point that I wanted to make, I hope I'm not taking too much of the time for the introduction, is the timeline. So what I want is that this is finished completely, the whole legislative process, by the end of this legislative term. This essentially means by the end of next year, because when we enter 2024, it's the election year, and then all bets are off, as they say. So the timeline currently is that the first draft report should be ready by the beginning of February, and after that the negotiations between political groups in the parliament start. I think that's optimistic. It's pretty optimistic, or I would say ambitious, because of the magnitude of this regulation. But I think it's possible that we finish the process in the parliament by summer, so that we have the vote in committee hopefully in June, and then vote in plenary in July, so that we can start a trialogue with the council in just right after summer, hopefully at the beginning of September. So if we are able to follow this timeline, I'm confident that we will be able to finish this by the end of next year. This is also important for the European Health Union as a whole, because this is currently the most important legislative concrete new initiative in the area of health union. The pharmaceutical legislation has been postponed, so it probably won't be presented by the Commission before March or April, which means there's not a lot of chances that this pharma legislation is finalized before the end of this mandate. So I think that in the end this will stay as the most important concrete new piece of legislation in the area of European Health Union, which means that we have the additional responsibility also because of the European Commission and the whole concept of European Health Union to really get this done and to really make this the flagship initiative in this legislative term. So thank you very much. I don't know if I stay here. Okay.
Many thanks, dear Tomislav, for your clear words. Now I would like to invite our panelists, Nick Schneider from the Federal Ministry of Health in Germany. Dear Nick, please. Nick is for the second time with us. We've discussed data donation, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago, but that's not. Yeah, exactly. Then we have Petronil from Belgium, a researcher from, am I pronouncing right, Cienso? Cienso, okay. Please, Petronil, in the middle maybe. And Tobias Schulz, a representative of the industry, Pfizer. I think well known to all of us. And it's my greatest pleasure, please. I have to replicate my dear fellow colleague Moritz Fink, who unfortunately, because of personal reason, is not able to moderate the panel. So I'm going to try to do my best, and but I think that I can, having in mind the good preparation of Moritz, we are going to have perfect discussion. Maybe let's start with Nick. We had some. We have heard from Tomislav where the obstacles are. From your perspective, what is the promise? Where are the obstacles?
Well, that's a large question. I don't have 2 hours time, so I'll make it short. The big promise I see is now looking back at our presidency 2 years ago, where everybody thought, are you crazy to put secondary health data use as one of the key priorities of the German presidency as Germany? Wouldn't you be the last ones to call for this? And when we discussed it, we said, no, it's important to learn from others here. And I think maybe it's sometimes good to be a laggard in one area, to put something as a priority on the European level, to really use that momentum coming from Europe to drive change on national level. And that was the main idea we had, why it was very important to start a debate. And I'm extremely glad to see that the Council proposal is on the table now, and we are having this discussion on how to better make use of health data, and that it was very timely. I think the COVID-19 crisis showed us that actually we have a strong need to discuss those issues, and secondary health data use is imperative to us, as is primary health data exchange. If we are considering in a European Union that we are traveling, we have the 4 freedoms. The only 4th freedom we don't have is the freedom of our data. And the problems we see on the European level, that actually data is not allowed to cross from one country to another, we actually even in Germany have between the states. because data is governed on state level in Germany. So we do have 16 different state data protection laws, 13 different hospital laws governing and having precedence on the health data use on local level, plus church law and others. So, and we do have 17, not 16, we're 16 Länder, but we have 17 state data protection authorities plus one federal one. So the problems we see with the EHDS on a European level, we know them by heart on national level, and that's why our hope is to solve this on a European level, knowing that we have European rules, we supersede the ones we have on national level. I think having national legal basis which show us under these conditions, you are allowed to use that data for certain purposes, that will actually facilitate research, innovation, and above all, medical treatment and the healthcare of our citizens, not only in Germany, but in Europe at large. So I think that's why we put so much promise into it. Obstacles are there, as I just said. We have a very, very difficult and complex healthcare system in Germany. We have a self-administration which is very strong, which does have a lot of say. We're not a centralized system where the government can say what we need and what we can do. But I think we need to use this European drive now to actually bring also a mindset change. And I heard a couple of debates yesterday that we need to have a data use-friendly environment, that we need to have an enabling data protection interpretation, GDPR interpretation. I think this is something where the EHDS can help a lot, and that's why we are actually quite positive, although we see the obstacles, which are going to be tremendous, but I'm not going to go into the details of the draft themselves, but there we are in negotiations and in council and also with the parliament, but I think we will find solutions there. In the end, it's going to be all about making it realistic and doable to come to a consensus, hopefully by end of 2023.
So we are really happy that the German presidency in this respect was obviously a success. And many thanks, Nick, for your initial statements. Let's continue with Petronil from researcher perspective and also from the perspective of someone working for a Health Data Institute. How do you consider the European Health Data Space regulation?
Thank you. So indeed, we are a public health institute, Scienzano, in Belgium. And we have done multiple projects across Europe. For example, we're active in towards the European Health Data Space. And we really recognize what you just said. What we did is we went into 12 countries, and it's still running, to assess what are the data management systems, the data governance systems in countries to be able to allow sharing of data for reuse of data across Europe. And indeed, there is one really important thing to know is there is a wealth of data. There really is a lot of information that we have, but the problem is that it's fragmented, it's hosted in different organizations, and it's quite difficult and challenging and maybe not very clear of how you can get access to that data. And when I say access to that data, I mean being able to make direct scientific, undermined, evidence-based support to be able to make policy decisions. So just giving a very concrete example, in Belgium, we couldn't, or the federal government for policy purposes, actually couldn't know in terms of hospitalization which vaccine was given to which patient. And this is quite important to be able to make policy decisions straight away. So our hope is really that the European Health Data Space will be able to boost discussions, and this for sure is happening and already happened during the presidency, in the countries to think about what can we do to improve the situation. We need to be able to make sure that data is interoperable, and also that we are able to link the different data sources that we have within our countries, but also across countries. So I think with that respect, the European Health Data Space has mostly boosted countries on starting to get organized. Of course, we have some good students in class that already have what we call a health data access body, so a single point of contact where you can go and ask for access to data, but many countries don't. And with the help of this European Health Data Space initiative, countries are really starting to discuss, okay, how can we make one entry point where researchers, policymakers can go to request access for data, where then it can be processed a secure processing environment can be provided where the data can be analyzed, and then responses to important both research questions but policy questions can be made.
Many thanks. You've touched upon the issue of interoperability. We've discussed it on the second day of the summit, where Ian Brown practically demonstrated what interoperability means in the context of the Digital Markets Act. But let's continue with Tobias. Tobias, from the industry perspective, could you please comment? I mean, you know that we have done some dedicated work also at national level in Germany. Why it took so long?
Well, it works, right? Yeah. I would see it from a rather positive perspective. I think from the point of view from a research-based pharmaceutical company, this is definitely a landmark concept, a landmark project towards a European health union. And that is definitely something we support. And I would actually like to add 2 more points here, because I totally underline what the speakers have said before. One very, very important point, I would say a crucial point when we talk about also basically secondary use of health data, is trust. And we clearly see that the draft regulation, the concept of the European health data space, might indeed create a trusted setting for data exchange. And for patients, for us, use of health data that's a sensitive topic. Also when we talk about research. So trust is one very, very important point here. And the other one is, and that is maybe more the economic point of view, the European health data space definitely will increase Europe's capability in terms of research and development and competitiveness, global competitiveness, because it is totally clear from a also pharmaceutical research-based point of view that the access to data, the data usage, the use of real-world data will be the crucial point in the further improvement of pharmaceutical treatment and respectively also the creation of the development of new treatments. So for me, it's not like the question, why did it take so long? Yeah, I think we also have to distinguish here a bit between the European perspective and the German perspective, because we have some quite particular debates here in Germany, as Mr. Schneider has pointed out before. So I don't want to go here into detail anymore. Yeah, but harmonization it is.
Many thanks, dear Tobias. According to some EU surveys, an assessment of the EU member states' rules on health data in the light of the GDPR, some 81% consider the use of different GDPR legal bases. It makes difficult to share data across countries. You have touched upon some issue, dear Tomislav. Do you consider the EHDS as a concretization of the GDPR? Will it make it easier to process health data in the future in a more coherent manner across Europe?
I mean, that's the idea. Of course, the idea is not that the EHDS supplants, substitutes the GDPR. GDPR will still be enforced, but to try to fit it together. That will be one of the main challenges. But yes, one of the main issues that we hear from the stakeholders during a lot of negotiations, a lot of discussions. I already had meetings with 30 or 40 something stakeholders on this topic in the last month or so. This shows us how important this topic is, that one of the main problems is this different interpretation and different implementation of the GDPR. And one of the biggest roles, we'll see how to fit this together so that both of these legal instruments are aligned. What is important here is that when you speak in terms of consent, you know that that data can be used also within the context of GDPR on basis of consent, but also on if you have a legal basis, and this will be that legal basis. So in that sense, for health, this should make it easier that also, without explicit consent in some cases, like for secondary use, we can use data. And this is, I think, one of the primary objectives. But I have to say, this does not mean that I'm against consent as a concept. But we already had meetings with a lot of patient groups on European level who understand the situation. So, and they are willing to cooperate with us to really find the best possible solution, that if they explicitly don't want their data to be used, they can decide that, but in other cases that it really facilitates the use of data. So in the short answer, yes. So this should this should make it easier for the GDPR to be applied in the area of healthcare, interpreted, but also to make it easier but within the context of the GDPR also to use health data.
Many thanks. I think we can follow on. I mean, can we move away from the consent system at all? And what would be the most appropriate way?
That's a good question, but I will pick up on the GDPR first because I think it's a very important aspect. And I think indeed also what we've seen in our studies is that the GDPR actually in some countries have been interpreted even stricter. And so the initial idea of the GDPR was not to limit exchange of data or the reuse of data, but in practice, in many cases, it actually has had a consequence which we didn't anticipate. And actually, organizations were afraid, institutes, data holders were afraid to share data because they were afraid to infringe the GDPR. And I think what's really important for the EHDS regulation is to support its interpretation, to support the different countries in coming together and seeing how what that really means in practice, so that for sure it doesn't have those consequences of again being afraid to share data across Europe, because we're really in high need to be able to do so. So I think one of the requests that we got indeed from countries was, yes, we really would like a legal framework which explains how to reuse or how does the secondary use of health data. And we really welcome this EHDS regulation. But I think just like we heard in the previous panel, comprehensiveness is really important. And that's what we need to focus on. On the aspect of consent, this is not specifically my domain of expertise, but I think what was mentioned by the colleague is indeed that patients in general are really willing actually to share their data. Because if there's more exchange of data on why I have been hospitalized, what the consequences of my treatment were, I could actually help other patients. So there is really a value in sharing data. And also, one aspect we tend to forget is it's not only about patients, but it's also about the population. So data is not, I mean, of course, there is a lot of, and a wealth of data with regards to patients, but there is also a wealth of data on the population. So think about surveys, about cohorts, about registries. These all have really also very interesting data, which allows us to monitor the health of the population and to make decisions based on that. And for this, consent is extremely difficult. So I align with the position that a consent might not be the way forward for every single individual for all types of data collection. Thank you.
Many thanks. I would like to announce that there will be a chance for questions from the audience, so please get ready in a couple of minutes. But you can reflect on what Petronine...
Yeah, I would just like to emphasize two things. So first, when we speak of use of data for secondary use, so we are not saying that you will use some individual's health data with his or her name, and individual health data, so that you publish certain someone's health condition, something like that. So we are speaking about aggregated data, which is data which anonymized, which will be only used for very specific purposes, and usually for which amounts to big numbers of people. So it won't be Nick Schneider has this condition or whatever, but he will be but his data will be taken into account as one of the persons who who are part of a certain category of people who are important for certain research or a survey. So like that. And this is the way how this will be protected, how personal data will be also protected. But the second point, what is also important, is that this use of data, secondary use of data, will be done in a secure environment, which means that it's not just anybody can come from the street and use this data, but there will be a whole process through this new governance system that we will create. So we will have health data access bodies in each member state. This will be required by the regulation. And also to harmonize the interpretation, we'll have the EHDS board on the European level, which will consist of representatives of member states. We will also try to include as many stakeholders in there as possible, including patient groups, if I can say, so that we actually get a big consensus on what can be done and what not in the process of implementation.
Many thanks. I think Nick
also
was moving all the time. Please.
Well, as a physician by training, I'm very much moved by the secondary use of data, because we are used to use it for primary purposes. So if I get a patient, or when I was still practicing, would get a patient, I use the data for her or his treatment. And then usually that data is stored somewhere and remains there. And for public health reasons, for management of healthcare, for research, for innovation, that data becomes useless because it's stored somewhere on a computer, sometimes even offline, and it doesn't flow back to the system. And I think, as you correctly said, we have to make that data usable again. And the data, it doesn't mean that it has to be connected to a name. It has to be de-identified. And of course, there's a risk of re-identification. Because if I have longitudinal data, I can overlay that with other data sets and could identify someone. So what we have to do is, we have to include enough safeguards to ensure that this is not done. So at the Health Data Lab in Germany, for instance, we said, if you try to re-identify an individual out of the claims data, which is stored at the Health Data Lab, you will have up to 1 year of prison. So that's even a stronger sword than we have in the GDPR for misuse. The EHDS regulation even states there are certain purposes which you are forbidden to use the data for, even if you get access to. And I think that we have to have a strong sanction mechanism for abuse, but give the necessary legal clarity and certainty to data users under which conditions they can use it. Because right now, a researcher, and I was a researcher myself, I was doing cancer research at the German Cancer Research Center. It was impossible to know under what conditions I can do research, and it was impossible to know who has what data and how I could access it under which conditions. And I think that's what you just said. We need to have metadata catalogs. We need to have a health data access body, central coordination units, which know which data is where, which is accessible under which conditions. The conditions can in the end be different. And I think then it's going to be the request which travels to the data, and the data travel to the researcher. And I think the researcher can live with that. And another point which I haven't addressed yet, and you rightly said it for the pharmaceutical industry, but let's look at medtech industry. Let's look at artificial intelligence. Right now, we are training data which is being applied. Algorithms are being applied in healthcare abroad of Europe. We're using data sets in India, in China, in the US. We don't know if this data is biased. We don't know if these algorithms are really applicable to our population. Isn't that an ethical question to provide that data for trading purposes? To provide the data to the industry, but also for validation and for regulatory purposes, to reevaluate if that algorithm is in the end applicable to our population. Otherwise, we run patient safety risks, and we shouldn't run those risks. And I think that's why we need to ensure that data can be used. And to be very honest, the AI doesn't care if data is from Nick Schneider or Petronio Burkhardt. It does care that the data is well curated, has high quality, and is applicable. And I think that's what we need to enforce. That's why the EHDS, I think, is a game changer and is a very important milestone on European and also national level.
Tobias, could you maybe reflect from practical perspective and from your industry, to take a look with industry eyes on the regulation? I mean, now we're talking about regulation, And we've learned from the past experiences with the GDPR how huge the differentiation in the EU is. I hope we won't have the same experiences that we made with the GDPR, the same as with this proposal. What level of anonymization, according to you, is appropriate in order to have concrete results?
That's now a question. I would say, first of all, and that is in terms of harmonization, again, a big issue. Let's define anonymization. Yeah, because so far we argue a lot what actually anonymization means, and it's not defined within the GDPR, or let's say the methods are unclear. As Mr. Schneider has pointed out before, we have 17 state data protection officers within Germany. They are not so, or well, let's say they are still arguing about the right methods of anonymization. And as you pointed out before, the EHDS, and I think that is particularly regarding rare diseases, a very interesting point, introduces a new category of data, which is non-personal data with a risk of re-identification. And here, and that is indeed also a point of harmonization, and I hope this will be addressed within the legislative procedure now. Again, the question comes up, what do we define as anonymized data, and when does this high risk of re-identification apply? So for me now to say, like, this is the right level of anonymization, that is just not possible. Yeah, I think we always need to find the right balance between using the data for the defined purpose and data protection. And it is clear that there is a strong patient's interest in data protection and anonymization. But there might be cases, and the EHDS addresses this as well, where the applicant for data sets applies or asks for access to pseudonymized data sets in contrast to anonymized data sets. There might be situations where this is justifiable.
Many thanks. I've announced it, and now is the chance. Do you have maybe questions from the? Do we have questions from the audience? Please. We have one micro. Just a second. Please.
Günther Tau from the company TBS. I have a little bit provocative question to Nick. I think it was beginning of this year, the Chaos Computer Club found out a lot of holes inside the health system in Germany. So when you are employing hackers in the Ministry of Health.
Have you come to this idea? Or
when we get them on the market. If we get them, we would hire them. No, to be very, very serious. That's a very important question. We are working with the Chaos Computer Club already. For instance, for the Corona Warning app, we were in exchange, and for the COVID certificates, we were in exchange with them. And when it comes to the health data lab as the BfArM, of course, cybersecurity is an extremely important issue, and there we are hiring personnel. We actually even have an own unit for interoperability and cybersecurity in our digital health department at the Ministry of Health. So it is an extremely important issue, and we are in exchange with the relevant stakeholders, although we usually don't use that as a, how would I say, PR stunt. Whereas it's our talks which we have in the background, and we involve civil society as much as possible.
Petronel, please.
If I may pick up on that question, I think we are lacking skills in public health. I think one of the skills that we're lacking indeed is this combination IT and public health. So hacking is one area, but another area is that we're moving towards building metadata catalogs, secure processing environments. There's a lot of technical expertise that is needed to be able to build that. And I think this is really where Europe, we need to step up. It's bottom up, build up that capacity in different countries to be able to have the combination of these skills of public health and IT.
And provided the necessary funding, because it's not only talking about bioinformatics, but also being able to pay the relevant salaries, because you have to compete with big players on global level to get the right skills and retain them in Europe.
Yes. We have two more questions, Professor Kerber and then Angela Velkova.
Von Kerber, University of Marburg. I think secondary use of health studies is very important. I would like to know a bit more about, because I'm an economist, about now what has been done with the data. So in that respect, I think we have here Pfizer, so it's a commercial company who is developing pharmaceuticals, which is great, but which is also patented at the end, and a patented product is sold afterwards. But there are also non-commercial uses by public institutions. So, and the question is also, research about health can be very broadly defined. So in that respect, where is the line? So how far is the range of how this can be used also? Because there is also healthy food or something like that. It's not only pharmaceuticals in the traditional sense. So I would like to know a bit more about the range of the usability of this, and what the conditions then also are, how this can be used, also from a commercial perspective, from an economic perspective.
Maybe we collect first the question and then we continue. Angela, please.
Thanks, Pancho. Angela Vilkova from FTI Consulting. I have a question pretty much for every one of the panelists. There's the Darwin EU program that just announced the data partners. It's an initiative from the European Medicines Agency, which basically says it's going to be the pathfinder to how the EHDS can provide meaningful data for regulatory decision-making. And then in parallel, last week in Paris, also the EHDS 2 pilots kicked off. I know Cienzano is also part of that work. So how are the two going to align, going to sort of cooperate? Is there the intention of how to connect the two? Because I see them both as the platform to achieve the same thing, which is basically show how the EHDS can work in practice.
Thank you, Angela. And we have one more there. Please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say to you, the moderator, you're doing very well, so you don't have to wait for Moritz. My question is from Tobias and Nick Schneider, that a lot of companies in Japan and USA are already using real-world data for the regulatory purposes. So what's your take on this thing in Europe specifically? Thank you.
Many thanks. Keeping in mind that we are running out of time, maybe you decide what...
I mean, I make it very short on my side. Regulatory purposes, these two questions I can combine in one. Regulatory purposes are extremely important. I think that's something we saw during the COVID pandemic, how important it is to have reliable data. Just taking a look at what Israel could do and how fast they were with actually proving and showing that certain public health measures had an effect on population level. And I think that's something which is going to be crucial. And I think there we have to empower our own administrations, our research institutions, like we have the PI, the BfArM, the Royal Koch Institute, to actually be faster in using the data and coming up with concrete policy measures, not 1 year later, but within, hopefully, days or weeks. And I think that's something which the EHDS as a promise could offer. And that actually comes into regulation as well. When it comes to differentiation, who gets access to that data? There's a whole list of purposes which currently being negotiated in the EHDS. But in the end, it has to be a purpose in the public interest. And there I'm back with the GDPR. So it has to be in the public interest. There are a few aligned there. And the research purposes. There is very valid scientific research conducted by the by the pharmaceutical industry, by medtech industry, together with researchers. So it doesn't always have to be public research institutions applying for a grant. The relevant part is to have a secure processing environment and to have very, very concrete techno-organizational measures to ensure that the data is not going to be misused and cannot be misused. And that, for instance, and that's something which the EHDS also is including there, that this data now talking specifically about the pharmaceutical industry, is not being used for market purposes, for market research, but for scientific research. And I think those are the lines we have to draw. But this is still on the negotiation, which ones are there, but it's going to be quite broad. And I wouldn't differentiate because we're talking about different sectors, and right now, the data spaces need to communicate one day. Health, climate, food, nutrition, they all are interlinked. And as a physician, again, that's relevant information to me. I need to have that data linked to know what is happening with my individual patient, with the citizen I'm treating. And that's the important part.
Maybe we continue with Petronil on...
Thank you. So on the question on what is the data used for, well, in public health institutes, it's really very large, of course. There's always the principles from the GDPR that are respected, privacy also, that the minimum amount of information is collected, not more, it's stored a certain amount of time. And even before the GDPR was there, we were doing that already for years. But it's really important to be able to make use of that data. One example is only now, actually, the mortality statistics are being corrected because you have the doctors that are filing the actual death certificates and you have the deaths that are recorded in the hospitals, for example. These need to be aligned. And actually, only now we know how many COVID-19 deaths we have. So I really agree with everything you said. But we hear so often we want results and data now, but often it takes time to process actually all these things to be able to make good evidence. And I think that's sometimes we got the blame during COVID saying, you're saying something now and you say something different in 2 weeks' time. But that is because we live in an environment where things are rapidly changing, where different scientific evidence is coming in at different times. So we try to cope with that. And that's why it's important to be able to have this data as well and keep on being able to do the research we need to do to actually provide more and more correct answers as we move along. And then the question on Darwin and the EHDS2 pilot. So the idea of the European health data space is to build the roads, the pipelines between different nodes that own data, that collect data, that work on data. And so I think the EHDS is in the pilot, we're trying to build the roads, and what Darwin is doing is building the cars. So what's going to drive on the roads? And that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you for this metaphor. Great. Maybe the final remarks go to Tomislav. You know the motto of this summit is sustainable competition, and we haven't touched upon also on the geopolitical dimension. What's on your mind?
Oh, that's a very good question. I just wanted to comment on the use. Yes, of course, the whole idea is to use data for public good, but in the end, when pharma companies use this for research innovation, in the end, there could be profit there. But this is something that is not prohibited in itself. But I'm saying this because I know that in the parliament we'll have a lot of discussions on this because there are some political groups who are very, let's say, sensitive about this issue. But I think, and I always say this, we don't have to give special benefits to the pharma companies, but we have to work with them as partners. And now to connect this with your question, yes, European is lagging behind. So of course that we need high standards in general. But we are competing with the US, with China. Their standards, yes, in many cases are lower, and they have stronger incentives for the companies, for the business and investments to move there. And we really have to think in these terms. We are not isolated. We cannot say, yes, you have to invest money here under these standards and these conditions. If we impose too strict standards and conditions, capital will go elsewhere. So it's a fact. So definitely we have to find a balance there. We have to find Europe, make Europe more competitive. Us in the EPP, and we are here in this setting. We are always fighting against too much bureaucracy, too many obstacles. The Commission doesn't always see eye to eye with us on this one, so I know that they are planning to introduce more than 100 new pieces of legislation by the end of this mandate. So we are, again, I think, over-regulating many things. So we are, again, proceeding with new regulation. And definitely, I don't think this is good in terms of competitiveness in competition with the foreign partners. Plus, you take into account the fact that we have 27 different regulatory frameworks, 27 different national setups, which are, again, creating additional obstacles. And we should not create additional obstacles on European level. So European level should be there to remove national obstacles, to harmonize as much as possible. Of course, we cannot harmonize everything, but to remove those obstacles that we can remove. And I mean, if you look at the broader geopolitical setting, yes, of course, US is our partner and we cooperate. But in terms of economy, I mean, we all know what's going on today about it. There are also Trump is not president anymore, but still, it's America first. Sorry. I mean, you look at with this whole package of the administration of support for green business. You can see that we really have to think also in these terms. Yes, they are our partners, but we are also, in terms of economy, competing with them, and we have to see how we can become more competitive. And I think this will be the future for Europe, especially since now we are also, because of the energy crisis, this is affecting Europe much stronger than the US. The prices went much higher of energy and in Europe than in the US. This is also putting a burden on our industry, on our competitiveness. So we have to take all of these things into account and really protect European interests, of course, not to fight with the others, but to really see how we can make Europe more competitive on the global level. And EHDS, if done right, can really improve the situation, I think, there.
We know exactly what does it mean to be a rapporteur on such an important proposal, and we know how important it is to have a good rapporteur. I'm convinced that you're going to have a lot of success with this proposal. We have a bit time for, I believe the target is till the end of the mandate of this commission, and I truly hope that the European health data space is in the interest of all Europeans. Many thanks. I really enjoyed the debate with you. We are continuing in approximately 10 minutes with another concrete example in the field of mobility, and please be on time. Many, many thanks to the speakers.
Yeah, we go on with the next discussion panel. Also a very concrete example of a data space we want to discuss about mobility data spaces. Gaia-X Tangible is the title of this panel. Well, digitalization and data sharing in the mobility sector come with high hopes and expectations, especially regarding, and that's coming back to the subtitle of the Data Summit, Sustainable Competition, expectations towards more sustainability in the transport sector, which means more efficient traffic, greener transportation, but also sustainability in terms of more inclusiveness and, of course, also economic sustainability. And all those hopes and expectations that come regarding the mobility sector when it comes to data sharing, usage of data, is on place. But although many data is produced and collected every day, the critique is that it is not used fully in the way it could already. So we want to discuss about what are the challenges and solutions in sharing mobility data and make them interoperable. My name is Lucas Lingenthal. I work at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation as Policy Advisor for Mobility, Urban and Rural Development. And I'm very honored to present to you my distinguished guests, which is on my left-hand side, Dr. Andreas Heindl from Acatec. He is head of the mobility data space here in Germany, the Datenraum Mobilität. And on my right-hand side, Francesco Bonfiglio, CEO of Gaia-X. Unfortunately, on a very short notice, we cannot count with Carmen Schmidt. So unfortunately, the perspective from her point of view, from the industry, the car manufacturer's perspective, will miss on this panel. But I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion either way, and a discussion that maybe gets us a good idea about what does it mean to establish a data space in practice. And there we have now the example of the mobility data space. And therefore, Andreas, the first question to you, what is, in your view, the most crucial point to establish such a data space that it also works in the way it should?
So when we started, there were a few factors which were really crucial. First of all, Arcatech is some kind of neutral player to bring together all the different stakeholders all around the mobility system, the car manufacturers, suppliers, the individual traffic, the public transport, different service providers and so on. To bring them to one table, it was necessary to have one player in the middle who was trustworthy to all of the stakeholders, and then to discuss about the technical framework, the infrastructure, and to decide on how to set up the mobility data space. And what we learned is that it's all about use cases. You have to come from the application, from the solution for the mobility sector, and build around the infrastructure, also the legal framework, and most of all, the ecosystem, to include all of the major players within the community. And that's one of the major points about the mobility data space. It's not only a technical framework or a technical solution, but it's an ecosystem which started in Europe, in Germany, but has a European perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. Coming to the European perspective, Francesco, I would be interested also in your point of view in order to explain a little bit how Gaia-X is putting in practice the establishment of a European mobility data space, and what are the major obstacles you have to deal with?
Well, I think that mobility is one of many data spaces. We heard about healthcare before, and actually the challenges are exactly the same. If I should pick one word, I think it was mentioned by Tobias, I think, was trust. So in other words, why data spaces do not exist today? This is the key question. Do we miss technology? No. Do we miss business cases or use cases? No. Do we miss the data? No, actually we have more data than we can handle. We miss a common trust framework. In other words, there is no regulation talking about trust. I know you've been talking in these 2 days about Data Governance Act, Data Act, a lot of new regulations coming around the corner. But if you think about that, where is trust? Is there a trust regulation definition? Actually, trust is a combination of 3 main ingredients. One is, of course, regulation. Regulations are important. 2 is verification or verifiability of those regulation fulfillment of compliance. And 3, and I think most important, is objectiveness of this verification. So Gaia-X is exactly trying to do that. We are trying to translate this concept of trust into a technology framework implementing a set of rules. And basically, what we aim to is provide transparency, controllability, and interoperability of services through a transparency framework. We call it the trust framework. And that's why I believe the mobility data space, which is one of the most important being engined by Gaia-X, is seeing the light, not because it was something new, but because of, again, some key phenomena. One, and I like to say this, is the new normal, as we all call it now after the pandemic, is creating a completely new need for mobility. In other words, mobility has become an enabler for society. It's a completely decentralized, distributed society. Therefore, we need a fabric to connect this distributed society, and mobility is a fundamental element of it. Second, mobility intrinsically is based on a concept of federated infrastructures. You can imagine railways, streets. What are they? They are federated infrastructures. Therefore, we need to build on top of that, we need to build these federated data ecosystems, which are the data spaces. And last but not least, let's not forget that mobility is the best combination, and I hope Andreas agrees with me, when you try to combine together two of the key missions of the European strategy overall, which is the combination of the Green New Deal, or sustainability, and digital transition. Putting them together in the smart mobility is the best way to reduce carbon footprint, increase sustainability, and as well digitize one of the most important ecosystems. So the way Gaia-X is helping is not providing new technologies or, let me say, reinventing the wheel, but creating this missing element of trust. In this way, like Andreas said, you can put together different actors around a federation. They need to trust each other. They need to find, of course, technical mechanism to exchange the data, but most importantly, they need to trust who they share data with, and the data sharing must be purpose-driven. In other words, I know why I share, I know what I share, and I know what is shared with me in order to get a reciprocal value. This is what the mobility, data around mobility data space is doing, but all the other data space projects in Gaia are doing. So the common denominator is this common concept, common core of trust.
Mm-hmm. How you put up this trust? I mean, trust is something very hard to build up and very easy to lose again. Yeah, how does it work? How do you bring all the different players together at the mobility data space? And are there players that you would like to integrate which are still not cooperating as you would wish for?
So, as I said before, it's about a player who is able to bring together the other stakeholders. That's, I think, one of the success factors, first. Second, there are players which should provide more data, and we should empower them to share data. What I have in mind are infrastructure providers, municipalities, and so on. For them, it's sometimes hard to share data or to provide data in the required quality. Yeah, we have some kind of NAP, national access points, throughout the European Union. But this is only to provide data in a certain infrastructure. Now it's about getting out real information from the data to use it for use cases and to make real solutions out of it. And that's something which is really, really important to get data on traffic signs, to digitalize traffic signs, or to get the data in real time from dynamic signs at the highways to improve the mapping, the maps of the OEMs or from map providers and so on. And this is something where the mobility data space is able to incentivize them and to build bridges in order to provide more data for good solutions, for sustainable solutions.
And the question about the data quality, is it a question of lacking resources, or is it a question of not the willingness to share the data in the requested quality?
Well, there are several reasons for it. Sometimes it's just regulation, that you only have to provide data you have and just put it in, and nobody cares about the quality. The other thing is that you have transformed data to get the required quality for a certain solution, and this is something where the mobility data space is putting around an ecosystem also, not only for data providers and data consumers, but also for service partners, in order to pick the data, enhance the data, and give it back to the mobility data space for use cases.
Mm-hmm. Again to you, Francesco, and again thinking of it now on the European level, all those the challenges Andreas mentioned for the mobility data space here in Germany. I can imagine that then putting this together from different member states of the European Union is even more challenging. How do you moderate this process?
Well, Gaia-X is an association of 360 members from all over the Europe and outside of Europe. So one of our key enablers is actually the working tables on verticals. Mobility is one of them, where we have this co-opetitive approach, which is fundamental to implement data economy. Because maybe you have touched upon it, but the elephant in the room is that when you talk about data economy, you have to put together actors that in nature, they are competitors. So that's why they don't share data, because so far sharing data was supposed kind of losing the intellectual property or competition factor. This is what is happening in the tables, around the tables that Gaia-X is facilitating, enabling, is this magic. So people that in nature are competitors, they sit together, they design use cases, like in the mobility case, and they define ways to exchange data for the common value. So we have also several mechanisms. So we have a central association, which is based in Brussels, but we have hubs, which are satellites in different regions. So we have a hub in Germany, Acatec is leading the hub in Germany, we have hubs in Italy, France, Spain, etc. Each hub is a kind of regional, let me say, think tank. In other words, it groups all the enterprises and the actors of that region in the different sectors to mind about how to improve, how to implement data economy in the private and the public sector. Plus, we have contacts in the local governments. So we have a governmental advisory board, which now groups 15 states, which are the member states where we have a Gaia-X hub up and running, sitting around the table twice a year, and involving the representatives from the ministries of the different European member states devoted to the digital transition. So this value chain means from the central association, we create the premises to this framework to make data, let me say, spaces possible. In the hubs, we collect the local actors that are trying to translate this into effective, concrete, real projects for that countries. But then we put together all the countries. So all of a sudden, a project that was born in Germany, for example, Data around mobility, it becomes a European data space project involving Italy, France, and other countries. And the same applies to all the others. And last but not least, we have the local governments supporting it, which means in concrete terms, the recovery funds or other investments resources are not just spent on a single country, but if that project is for the common interest of multiple countries, the magics of combining interests, funds, and resources and actors all around the concept of Gaia-X happens in our table. So I think this is not trivial. In particular, if you think about mobility, everybody of us know what it takes to travel by train from Italy to Germany or Belgium. So behind this, the infrastructures are there. The business models are there. Also the billing mechanism, etc. That's not complicated. What do we need? We need a common platform to make this, let me say, digital ecosystem come true, like I said before, and the trust is the necessary element, and it must be scalable. In other words, it must be open to new players, from many countries, potentially even abroad. That's the magics, let me say, that we are making happen. We're just facilitating it in terms of working tables, but we are making it possible through the implementation of rules and technologies to make this data space trustworthy as possible.
Mm. How or do those incentives to participate, to cooperate, also for companies, are they or how are they perceived by let's say the big players? Also, for example, the car manufacturers. Do they also cooperate, share in the way, at least from your perspective, which is enough, or is there something there where would you say that there needs improvement?
I'll take it and then I'll leave it to Andreas. I give you my perspective. So you touched upon the big players. So let's talk about mobility. Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler are part of the Data Around Mobility project. They are also part of another project which is called Gaia-X, which is the data space around, let's say, the digitalization of the automotive ecosystem. I think it's the largest in the world ever I've ever seen, to be honest, because it does not include just German companies, but Stellantis, Ford, and others. But all of a sudden, we had our summit in Paris a few weeks ago, and all these projects were on stage. Believe it or not, even during that summit, Gaia-X and other projects, for example, that are creating federations in the manufacturing space and the mobility, they are talking together because they said, well, we need to federate each other. So the magics of cross-domain federation is happening. So the answer to your question, how are the big players reacting to it? Well, the big players do not have all the, let me say, the power and the capability to build this big thing, because you can be as big as you want. You never own all the data you need in order to make this magic of common data spaces. You must rely on others. Therefore, you must find a way to federate, trust, and be trusted by others. Second, you don't have all the skills. So the federation between large and small and even startup players is fundamental to make it happen. Let's not forget, Europe is a SMB, is a small medium business world, and the skills and competencies most of the times are not in the large enterprises. So again, this federation is an opportunity to bring small and large players together. Last but not least, the large players, they are forward-looking, so they understand that federating, cooperating, if you want, with competitors for the common good creates a competitive advantage and creates also possibility to change their business model, because maybe we have not discussed it, but think about the automotive. The business is completely changed. The business of automotive is becoming a business of mass mobility as a service in all senses. So if you have created in 3 decades, or in 100 years, an industry of manufacturing, basically, and you have to turn your business into a data platform for mobility as a service, or completely servitized, you cannot do it yourself. You must do it together with others. So they are completely into it in a way that I have not seen before. So in a cooperative approach.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. As the car manufacturers are turning more and more to data companies and so on, and they are really committed in a very practical way to the mobility data space. They are all shareholders in our organization, and they are providing data. That's a very, very important message for all the other participants, that the big players and small and medium-sized companies, startups, public transport and so on are committed to the mobility data space, and we created the level playing field for sharing data. And creating this kind of level playing field in a technical but also in an organizational and legal way means that all of them can share data on equal footing. And we can really have a marketplace for data in Germany, but all over Europe. That's the first point. The second point, Francesco already mentioned this. It's about cross-domain linkage. And we are not only talking about genuine mobility data coming out from cars or trains or traffic signs and so on. The first use case we made 1.5 years ago was a connection between FreeNow and the German Weather Service. This is mobility-related data. And this is something very, very important to understand, to tear down walls between the silos of certain domains. And that's also the reason why Arcatech is not only thinking about a mobility data space, but also on data spaces in health. We talked earlier this day, culture, production, whatever. We are talking about several data spaces, and exactly between these data spaces, there is where innovation can happen. And there is really, there can be very, very interesting use cases and business cases in the end.
Yeah, that's touching a point we discussed now in the break, and before opening also the panel for questions from the audience. One last question from me to both of you. When we talked earlier about the establishment of a European health data space and now the experiences you already have with the mobility data space, which also includes not only but also quite sensitive personal data. What is there from your experience something which can also help to enable and to develop another data space like the health data space, for example?
So we made a lot of experience in setting up an infrastructure, a technical infrastructure, where you can look up data via a catalog, and it's a very lean infrastructure. We are providing identity management. This is what Francesco also mentioned, to provide trust between the different players. We made the ecosystem around it, and the sharing of data is organized via connectors. This is some kind of API which is able to execute usage policies. And that's very important when we are talking about data sovereignty and so on. And this is applicable to other domains. This is the mobility data space infrastructure is domain agnostic. We can scale it in the vertical way from regional, national to European data spaces, but also in a horizontal way across domains. And this is something what we learned in the beginning. We were very, very fast because we took the things which were already there and invented them not on the green field, but took what's there and put it together in a creative way and created the mobility data space. And this is an offer also for other domains.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I heard also before that, and I suppose in these 3 days, the discussion around personal data, consent management, and et cetera, was very intense. Let me tell you my considerations. All the data we talk about will be personal data in a short while. And maybe some of you have started reading the Data Act. There is some key elements the Data Act is introducing. To me, the 3 most important are the fact that personal data and non-personal data are becoming, well, the intent is they become the same. So I can exercise my rights on data created starting from my personal data, which makes this very powerful. The second element is the need to provide evidence of the value built starting from my data. And the third element, which is quite subtle but is there, is the need to share the value also to those that provided the data. Now, if you put these 3 elements together, The future economy is going to be driven by personal data and the ability to get the consent to treat them, which is not just the GDPR consent management. It's much more deeper. In other words, I'm willing to provide my data if the service you provide me is useful, me as a citizen. Second, I recognize I trust you, so I trust the way you treat my data. Third, I can change my mind, and I do not have to. And if I want to change my mind, I can do it. And I can switch my data wherever I want. But if I don't have to, because you can scale and expand, I'm even better willing to do that. So think about the mobility. Mobility plus insurance. Mobility plus healthcare. Mobility plus healthcare and insurance and school and whatever type of data spaces. Me as a citizen, if I can trust an ecosystem that is naturally scaling out and up, providing me more and more services based on a trustworthy technology, I will be more than willing to provide my data as long as I get the value back. Now, it's a provocation I make. I didn't want to ask the question before, but okay, you have been talking about consent. Think about how many of you have a Google subscription. 99% of the people don't know the very moment you subscribe to Google, basically, you give the consent to trace your position, unless you take it off. So, and the same applies to, Apple Watch or Fitbit Fit trackers. You give consent to get access to your health data, believe it or not. So maybe we should, first of all, think about how can we leverage those data that citizens have already provided trust in those platforms, for whatever reason, and make use of those data also in, why not, European-driven data spaces. I mean, if a European citizen trusts a non-European platform, maybe it could trust also a European data space. So maybe that should be the first point, instead of trying to work around the problem with additional legislation and regulations. And I think the mechanisms are there. The use of data and metadata is there. These big data platforms know exactly how to make use of metadata, being compliant with the GDPR. So let's try to leverage the trust that citizens are putting into the data platforms, building new data platforms, more transparent, more interoperable, more scalable, providing more services to the citizens, and the citizens will be willing to provide their data. I think it's a game of mutual benefit.
Thank you very much. Now, because I promised it, I would like to open up the stage for questions from the audience. Over there, please. I will just...
Another provocative question to Francesco. In the year 2019, a guy from the startup scenery was saying, well, Gaia will be a lame duck in the future. And I would like to ask you, why Daimler, as well as BMW, are using or looking or have selected AWS instead of the European solution. Is it a lack of marketing?
It's not a question you should ask me, you should ask them, but would you want to collect questions first, Bencho?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry.
Wolfgang Kalber, University of Marburg. I've understood that Gaia-X is mostly about data markets and developing trustworthy data markets and helping data exchange. I think we talked yesterday a lot about data markets, and I would like to focus especially on car data. So the one thing is really that the car manufacturers themselves can really provide data and can use exactly Gaia-X and for really selling also car data. The other point is that we have seen now the Data Act, who gives also now the users of IoT devices the option really to share data with others, third parties, who perhaps also can aggregate data and also be intermediaries. And my question is, on one hand, whether Gaia-X would also can also be a mechanism really that also sees intermediaries who can aggregate data that they are collecting from many, for example, car users, can also use then for enabling data exchanges and also use your infrastructure and what you're for using now the new rights from the Data Act. And the other point is, a year ago, we published, Luisa Specht, a study here commissioned by the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for this data summit, where we talked about really the governance generally about car data. And, you know, there's a big issue about competition and innovation in secondary markets of car data. And the point was whether the Data Act already solves this problem or whether we need additional sector regulation. And one other option would be to put these car data under the governance of a data trustee, and who then can give access to data in a non-discriminatory way to different stakeholders. And my question would be whether Gaia-X and also our system could also be a place for such kind of data trustee solutions, which can also be very important for many other contexts, and for example, health data, etc. And therefore, I would be interested in both of your opinions about this. Thanks.
We collect two more. Third question, but then yes. One to Damian Bosselager, and then you can answer.
Otherwise, my buffer will overflow. Too many questions.
Okay. One more. I'm Philip First. I'm with Gartner, the research and advisory firm. I'd like to come back to the question of trust, because I think it's really important. There's this idea that data spaces are gonna fly once they are in existence, which of course is not the case, right? And so I was wondering, you have touched upon this issue on how to foster trust and how to make these things actually happen. You know, everybody has an incentive to draw from a data space, but the incentive to, you know, contribute to data space is relatively small from a competitive perspective. What do you think the government, either at a national or European level, could do to further make data spaces become successful in the future?
Thanks. And the last one to Damian.
Yes, I have a bit of a question that relates to the first question that was asked about Gaia-X, which is why wasn't a European solution chosen? And the question I have is more, what is Gaia-X right now? Because it does seem to be changing from the beginning, when it was more the idea of a European federated cloud infrastructure, even though I have not fully understood what that means. And now it seems to be some form of an API, maybe, like an interface, a system for data exchange, or like at least in some aspects. So could you just like give us a very tangible idea of what exactly you're working on? And then the second part would be in relationship to the governance structures. So if it's, for example, some form of an API, like how can you make sure it's not just a couple of big companies with the help of consultants that are defining the interoperability standards of the future? Thank you.
Challenging questions. Francesco, I think some were directed to you.
Can we, otherwise I forget. So on AWS versus others, no, I was joking. Of course, this is a question to be asked to the users of technology. But the simple answer is that Europe has been lagging behind the business of cloud and technology. Now, the key question is why? And some even politicians believe that Europe has a knowledge or technology gap, which I personally believe is totally wrong. We have no gaps to fill. We only have one big gap, which is scalability. We miss the critical mass and the scalability that large providers have been building, let me say, before the European ones. So to give you numbers, the market of cloud, which is the motorway of data, is not data economy, but you need motorways to run cars, has tripled between 2017 to 2020, from 2 to 6 billions. The market share of European cloud service provider has declined from 26% to 16%, and the market share of, I have to say, 3 players in the world, you know them, has been has become stable because they own 85% of the market. Now, that tells one thing. The digital economy is becoming true. The adoption of the cloud is increasing, even in Europe. Is substantial, is essential, is not trivial business. Nonetheless, the European cloud service providers are not seeing competitive in terms, as I said before, scalability in particular, and reach. Now, what Gaia-X is doing, and that's why there is a lot of interest in our constituency, we have, let me say, 50-50 providers of technology and users of technology, so there is a common interest. Why is it so interesting? Because Gaia-X is riding a big change, which is not our decision. The change is that data is everywhere. So we live in a completely different world now than 2 decades ago, when the cloud was born. Cloud was born with the idea of distributed computing. Now, all of you know that actually cloud today is just a decentralized, remote, big mainframe. Now, the world has changed. Data are everywhere. Edge is moving the world. In other words, you need to bring compute to the data and not data to the compute. What Gaia-X is doing is enabling this ecosystem of distributed computing, distributed data, and federation across them. So on one side, we want to create federated data spaces. On the other side, we want to create federated infrastructure spaces. If you create federated infrastructure spaces, even the European players can become bigger, have a bigger critical mass, and scale up. One of the projects we have is called Structura-X, groups 35 European cloud service providers to build the largest federated cloud infrastructure offering in Europe, and not just in Europe. It's going to take a while, but the participation to this project was immediate. In 2 months, we had all the European cloud service providers participating. Why? Because none of them can compete, none of them has the critical mass, but none of them has a problem in being interoperable. And this is another game changer. In this world, you have to be distributed, interoperable, transparent, and controllable. If you have built your business and you own 30, 40, 50% of the market share, I have to shoot you to force you to be interoperable. I'm joking, but that's the reality. If you're small and the largest cloud service provider in Europe has got less than 2% of the market share in Europe, so even if you believe you are big, like OVH, Yonos, Aruba, they are very small, you know that federating is a matter of survival and being competitive. This is the, let me say, the paradigm shift that Gaia-X is enabling. Then, so Volkswagen, BMW, etc., they're just waiting for this, and they're absolutely open, I can tell you. But on top of that, and maybe I can answer a little bit of the other answer, what Gaia-X is, you know, everybody had different opinions of what Gaia-X should do. Everybody believed, well, we're building a new AWS in Europe, or we're building and whatever. This has never been the case. Gaia-X is building a framework that can sit on top of any technology to provide transparency, controllability, interoperability. 3 things. Now, you can plug into Gaia-X, or you can plug Gaia-X on top of it, as you like to see it, any technology. That's why AWS, Microsoft, Google, they are members of the association. The question is how flexible you are, how willing you are to engage with this new model, which of course provides you an opportunity to be transparent and interoperable, but possibly gives you less competitive advantage than the one you have. If you're small, you don't have a problem. If you're big, you might scratch your head a little bit. So what we are doing is defining a set of rules defined by the market to ensure these things I told you, interoperability, controllability, transparency. We are defining labels which are optional, but are a mechanism to verify the credentials of a service in order to pick and choose the one that best fits your needs. Again, transparency. And we are building a technology framework to implement the verification from an objective and technology-driven perspective, not human and not subjective. So we are trying to implement this concept of trust. And this has been the objective from the beginning. We are simply doing it. And how can we do it in a concrete way? What we have announced in Paris 3 weeks ago is the Gaia-X is up and running. In other words, last year we defined all these things in terms of paper. This year we developed it. What we developed? We developed the framework, and we developed the first projects, like the mobility and others. By the end of this year, we will have the first version of the Gaia-X Digital Clearinghouse. This is the name we gave it to it. Basically, what a clearinghouse is a node, if you want, of verification you can go at to exactly do the things I said. So be verified, if you are a service provider, against the Gaia-X rules. Or you want to create a federation, you can find the services to create a federation. Or you want to join an existing federation like the Data Mobilitat, you can find the service to join, basically, that existing federation. So we are creating these nodes to, let me say, enable a real market of Gaia-X compliant services and Gaia-X compliant federations. This is happening by the end of the year, restricted to the Lighthouse projects. We have 8 Lighthouse projects, mobility is one of them. And by March 23, this will be GA, so it will be generally available. We already have shown at the summit a list of 175 services provided by our members that are ready to publish catalogs of Gaia-X compliant services. So they are ready to show, well, you know, we're ready. Yeah, we want to do that. So once the clearinghouse will be up and running, these demo services will become marketplaces. This is the way we are triggering it, and the last question I captured, maybe I lost something, was about the governance of it. The governance is given by the technology. In other words, these clearinghouses will run services that are intrinsically controlled by the architecture we have developed, which is a decentralized architecture. So basically, all the compliance mechanisms, they write into a registry which is distributed, decentralized, immutable, etc. And all the nodes are synchronized together, so a single node cannot do whatever they want. And it's a sort of democratization, if you want, of the compliance verification according to the rules that have been defined by the association, which, I repeat, is a totally private organization. We have no affiliation with any institution. We have no funding. It's just the voice of the market. So far, I think we are possibly the only one project doing this stuff in concrete.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you want to add and also come a little bit maybe to the question from the gentleman about the data from cars.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. What Francesco said, we are doing on the Gaia-X level, we are doing some of these steps on a very practical level. For the mobility data space. And that means that we are linking different data spaces to each other. And we are doing the first steps, and what we are learning is that to link them in a technical way, that's not the problem. The technique is there. The problem is what Francesco also mentioned, the rules and how to manage identities between different data spaces, how to do smart contracting, and so on and so on. And this is the really interesting and complex thing, which needs rules on a very abstract level, and I think Gaia-X is the right place to do it this way, first. Second, the topic of the car manufacturers, and this was the question, as I understood, connected to data trustees and the question of trusted data. And both topics are covered by the mobility data space. We are working together in working groups very concretely to set up different trust levels. We already have some trust levels, yeah, but to set some trust levels on top, yeah, because we can enforce or we technically trust levels. And we are also discussing how to provide a service as a data trustee.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running out of time, and in order to being able to deepen the one or the other discussion at least a little bit in this next 10 minutes break. I will close the panel now. I thank you both very much for contributing, and to all of you for your interest and your questions. And then I hand over again to Pancho, Master of Ceremony.
We meet in 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. In 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have a session now, first with a keynote and then a panel. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker, who is a member of the European Parliament for the EPP, Maria Carvalho. So you are shadow rapporteur for the Internal Market Committee, and you've been an MEP for the EPP since 2009. What I really like about Ms. Carvalho is that you have a background as an engineer, and I think we dearly enjoy your perspective on the Data Act at the moment. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and to organizers of inviting me to be here today with you. As it was said, I'm a member of the European Parliament, of the EPP. I'm mainly in two committees, in the ITRE, so the Industry, Research, and Energy and Technology, and in the Internal Market Committee. But in both of them, because of my background, I tend to look a lot to the reports on more technological reports. In my first time in the Parliament, I was rapporteur of Horizon 2020. Now I have been rapporteur of the public-private partnerships of Horizon Europe and of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and a lot on the digital files. So in INCO, I usually look a lot to the digital files, the ethical aspects of artificial intelligence, and the digital decade. And now I'm the shadow rapporteur of the Data Act in INCO. So on this short speech, I will stress mainly 3 points. I will start with the data economy and data strategy, that a lot has been said. Second, I will talk about the Data Act in general, but in more particular in the part that is exclusive competence of the INCO. That is the title of this debate today, that is the cloud-related provisions. So it's what is called the Chapter 6 of the Data Act, that is exclusive responsibility of the Internal Committee, Internal Market Committee. And the third point, I will talk about, as you know, there is the position of the Commission. The Commission as the initiative is the Commission that starts the process with the regulation. It goes to the Council, it goes to the Parliament. It is attributed to the committees. The lead committee is ITRE, with Mrs. Pilar del Castillo, rapporteur from EPP also, that you have heard her, also in this summit. INCO has responsibility in a part of the report. So we, in the Parliament, in each committee, we developed our position. We do what we call the amendments, and we developed our position. So in the last part, I will talk in general what is the proposal of the Commission and what is my position, what I'm putting forward, and a little bit we can leave for the discussion how the negotiations are going, because not all the rapporteurs of the different political groups have exactly the same position, and we can discuss a little bit. So these are mainly the three topics that I will touch on the speech. So as it was already said today, the data economy is estimated to be worth over than 325 billion euros. These values of end of 2019, and the volume of data is constantly growing, and growing at a very high speed. Data is the basis for many new digital products and services, in particular for developing artificial intelligence applications and connected devices, the so-called Internet of Things. And so it's an important source of economic growth. Connected devices represent one of the key technologies in enabling the digital transformation, as the ability of the device to sense and transmit data brings to companies considerable benefits. But we should know, and it was already said here, that 80% of the industrial data today is not used. And we should find ways to exploit this potential, because it's an enormous potential, while respecting intellectual property rights of the industrial players, creating what was already discussed here, that this trust that is so important to build this economy, data economy. The potential for growth and the potential for innovation is enormous, but we need to get it right in order to untap this full potential for the economy and for the innovation. The European legislation already deals with many aspects that want to frame the increasing digitalization of our economy and our society. We can talk here of important role played by the GDPR, has been already mentioned here several times. Also, the European Commission has proposed the European Data Strategy, and later on we have the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, that was also presented here by my colleague Andres Schwab, and the data governance regulation that are an integral part of this data strategy. So the missing element is the Data Act, and it's going to be an important, in my opinion, is going to be an important act to finalize this construction that we need in Europe. The European Parliament, in a resolution last year, we did a resolution on the European strategy of data. We asked the Commission to present a legislation aiming to encourage and enabling a great and fair access to use data in business to business, business to government, government to business, government to government situations across all sectors. And the Commission did so. So we published in February of this year, 22, the Data Act. The Data Act can create a more agile data economy, especially by enabling an easier access to almost infinite amount of high-quality industrial data, deriving in particular for those generated by connected devices, sensors, and artificial intelligence. So the Data Act is very important because it's going to clarify in particular the rights of access and of the use of the data and the databases, enhance the use of personal and non-personal data in compliance with the GDPR, and improving the public services and policy making. Also facilitating the voluntary sharing of data by individuals and by business. Consumers and business will be able to access data of their devices and use it for aftermarket value and added services. Business and industrial players will have more data available and will benefit from a competitive data market. And finally, something that is where I'm working very deeply is the Data Act will improve the cloud switching process and the framework, because this is very important for Europe. So all these that are the objectives of the Data Act can have immense beneficial effects to unleash further potential of the data economy. It could ensure a more appropriate balance in the supply chains and to install a fair competition in European market that risks of being led by non-European players. And this is particularly true in the cloud market, which is an emerging sector, but a very important sector for the data economy. Cloud services are becoming essential for the use of available data, and the uptake of the related technologies is accelerating in whole Europe. The European Commission proposal of the Data Act highlights the rights principles. We are generally happy with the proposal of the Commission. Introduced a framework establishing some regulatory requirements for providers of cloud and edge data processing services. And it aims to ensuring that customers can switch from a provider to another in a more agile way than it is now the situation, without being forced by locked-in practices, reducing and removing undue costs and obstacles, while ensuring that the minimum level of equivalence of functions of the desired service is maintained when they do the switching. The importance of these provisions are explained by the current situation in the global and European cloud market. It was already also mentioned in the previous panel. The global market for cloud computing is dominated by 5 platforms from the US and China. The 3 largest ones alone hold a market share of more than 70%. And 85% of the cloud service provided within Europe are offered by outside cloud providers. So it's very difficult for Europeans to compete alongside with this, I would call it oligopoly more, and they are doing often concentrate on small, more exclusive offerings. The technologies of this century, such as artificial intelligence, connect industrial and manufacturing, telemedicine, autonomous mobility, smart cities, digital administration, are all based on the availability of data. And for that, we need cloud infrastructure and cloud providers. So, one important topic for the European sovereignty is to be able to have a European cloud market that people can choose if they want to have Europeans or non-Europeans. But at the moment, the situation is not that. It's very difficult to do a switch from a big provider to a European one. So we don't want to force them to change, but if a customer wants to change, they will have the conditions to change. So in the European Parliament, we are trying to help the emergence of a fair competition in our market, making sure that the rules create a level playing field. The Data Act addresses this sort of market failure because we consider that there is a market failure, and justifies the intervention of a set of rules that could overcome what voluntary codes of conduct and other agreements between market players who are not able to reach so far. So the present situation is if we leave it as it is, we will not be able to change, and the European companies will not be able to increase their market share. I support the general principles of the Commission proposal, which wants to make sure that the switching process is carried out effectively, using proactive collaboration of all parts involved and without excessive undue costs of the users. So what is my position in relate with the proposal of the Commission? I don't want to be, and I'm not, people that know me from previous reports, I'm not a protectionist. I like open markets and I like to be open to the world, but I also do not like that others are protectionists themselves. So I fight for a fair competition, a global fair competition. So I'm trying to balance and to see where are the obstacles and to remove these obstacles. For example, the responsibilities on the switching. The European Commission is also trying to do that, but I try to do slightly different way, in a more balanced way. For example, on the switching process, we have mainly three actors. The cloud provider of origin, the customer, and the cloud provider of destination. The European Commission puts all the responsibility and the costs on the cloud provider of origin in order to make easier the change. I have a slightly different approach, because I think that the cloud cloud provider of origin has a lot of the responsibility of the process, but there are also some responsibilities for the cloud provider of destination and the consumer. So to do that, I divide the switching in different steps, in actual 4 steps, and to make it easy to define the responsibility in each of the steps. The termination of the contract, the extraction of the data, the transformation of the data, the uploading on the new destination location. So this is an important point of the report. And to clarify very well the responsibilities of the different actors. The second point is the functional equivalence concept. I keep the functional equivalence concept, and this, it's important that at the end the process we can make sure that the new service that the user expects in the new cloud provider is based on the same objectives and the same functionalities than the previous ones. Third, and probably the most important one, is the fees. There are a set of fees to switch, and some of the fees are very high. Here I slightly have a different position of the Commission, but there is one point. The so-called egress fees, that there are, in my view, no technical motive to charge these fees. I have an amendment saying that they should disappear as soon as possible, and I give a maximum period of 2 years for these egress fees to disappear. I give, anyway, the possibility of have some fees if there is a complex technical work that needs to be done for the switching and needs to be paid. But if there is no complex technical justifiable work to be done, there is no reason for the customer to have to pay a fee, and sometimes very high fees, to change the cloud provider. Third, that is also very important, fourth actually, is the standards. So I think that it's very important to have standardized rules and to have European standards that are published in the Central Union Standards Repository, and also to have open source interfaces that have great benefits to this end, and we should acknowledge this. So these are probably the most important topics. There are many, but I'm not going to overload you with this, but the fees, the responsibility to remove the barriers of the switch and the standards and the functional equivalence are probably the most important points that make sure that the market is a free market, that you can choose your cloud provider, that you choose the one that serves you best, independent if it's European or non-European. Because the situation now is that you have a lot of barriers to change from the provider that you have, and the moment is dominated outside Europe. So to conclude, I would like to stress the importance of this dossier for the entire data economy. And the most probably important is that it will free a whole world of innovation, and it will create a single market to allow data to flow freely inside the European Union. But for that, we need to achieve all these parts, and I have concentrated in one chapter of the Data Act, so you will see that the complexity of the file. So an internal market across all sectors for the benefit of business, researchers, public administration, and society at large. Actually, I also made some amendments in the ITRE to the report of my colleague Pilar that I follow absolutely the line, but did some amendments that agreed by her also. For example, to put the SMEs are excluded and startups, but to make sure that they will be prepared to enter the data economy. And another one also to make sure that research institutions are also part of the data economy. So were the 2 points that in the general I have defend. This is a game-changing, overall, is a game-changing regulation. Empowerment and innovation is the 2 key words that if we get it right, it will happen with these regulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carvalho. Please join me on the panel. I will also call 2 fellow panelists of yours to continue the discussion. Solange Viegas dos Reis, you're Chief Legal Officer at OVH Cloud. And I would like to call Lucas Klinkholz from Bitkom. And you are leading on cloud and AI at Bitkom. So welcome. Thank you for joining me. So we're going to have to be a little bit good on time. I know that, well, you unfortunately have to leave at 2 p.m., I understand. So thank you very much for your presentation, Maria. I was hoping that perhaps, Solange, you could already jump in and provide your takeaways of this conversation. What did you think with respect to the different amendments or improvements, perhaps, that Ms. Carvalho proposed, the responsibility in the switching process, the functional equivalence, the fees for switching, the standards? Please, we're happy to hear from you.
Yes, indeed. I think that we are fully aligned at OVH Cloud with what Maria de Carvalho just told. Before going deep on the various topics you highlighted, I have to say that first, what is data sovereignty for OVH Cloud and for many European cloud provider today? That I think that it's important to remind that data sovereignty is at the crossroads of many notions. It's part of digital sovereignty. And in data sovereignty, we find the notions of freedom of use, freedom of choice, and this freedom must be accompanied by information about for what purpose the data is used, who can access the data. So the right to choose includes the right to know what is done around the data. The second notion we find in data sovereignty is competition, is the fairness, a fair competition. So it's fair competition's benefits to the users, benefits to the providers, and it's something that is key, and you highlighted it. It's key in data sovereignty, and we have some other notions around that, and all those notions will rely on 4 main pillars. These pillars are the first one is the one for what we are talking all together today is regulation. We need regulation to have a safe framework around data sovereignty. I think it's yes, the SAU of Gaia-X talked in the previous panel about trust. Regulation is trust. So if you do not trust on the framework where you're working, where you operate, if your clients do not trust, if the competitors do not trust, you cannot have a positive way of working together. You can have the right ecosystem. So this notion of trust is very important for us. It's the first pillar. The second pillar of data sovereignty is education, trainings. We need people strong in Europe to be able to reinforce, to strengthen what we did on this area. We need to help us to be stronger. The third pillar, is innovation. Of course, innovation is key. Many people talked about this before me. So innovation is allowed if you have the right framework. Again, the trust. And the last pillar is funding. We need funding. We need public support to develop data sovereignty. I'm thinking about the Buy Tech Act, for example, something that can be very important for European stakeholders. So all those pillars are key, and the first one about regulation is today we focus all today at the center of our attention, and the Data Act is a big part of this regulation. For us, it's a key initiative. It's a key block on terms of data sovereignty, because Data Act brings fairness, brings an opportunity to have more fairness on this topic, brings fair competition, brings freedom of choice again, and all this is very complementary with other initiatives, with other regulation we have in Europe. We already have the DSA, the DMA, for example. We have the Energy Efficiency Directive. We have some other regulations that create this trusted framework we need, and Data Act is one of them. So it was a little long, sorry, but just to give the global picture for us. And regarding the specific point of the Data Act highlighted by Maria, yes, of course, the switching must be easier than it is today. We at OVH, we are a 20 years old company, more than 20 now. We have more than 1 million 600,000 customers. We are present in 4 continents, 5 in few years, in 4 continents. So that means, what does that mean? That means that we know the market, we know the customers, we know their needs, we know the challenges. And what we see is that sometimes we have customers who tells us, I would like to leave my current provider, but the egress fees are very high. So if I do it, I will pay a lot, so I have no interest in doing it. So I cannot leave my provider. And in addition of that, what we see in the market sometimes is that some big providers, major cloud players, can propose kind of vouchers to their clients to test their product. So the voucher is something very fantastic. And even OVH Cloud proposes voucher to their clients. The only difference is that with this voucher, it's free. You have a free trial to test a cloud offer. So it's free to go in, but it's not free to go out. That means that what you do not pay when you go in, you will have to pay when you go out. That means that you're closed. And for us, cloud is a key opportunity, is essential in Europe. All the digital services are based on the cloud today. So cloud is of the essence of the digital economy, of the growth of European companies, of the European markets. But for that, we need to provide the clear framework. So that means, yes, no egress fees. We would like to give a frame to those vouchers, these vouchers offers, we will say. We agree that on top of switching, on top of standards are key too. So I just need to say that yes, I agree with what Maria told. We see it on a day-to-day basis. We see it with our customers, with our partners, and Data Act is a key opportunity, and we have to take it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maria, you wanted to react? Perhaps I saw you react to
we also have dealt with the vouchers. I didn't mention because there is a lot of other things that we have, but there is something that many stakeholders have told us, and we have also amendments to make sure that this is not a lock-in process to come in but not to get out. Mm-hmm. So we also have amendments on that issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Lucas, so we heard all the fundamentals of what it takes to have a data economy in the EU that is sovereign, independent, freedom of choice, funding, fair competition, regulation, innovation. From your perspective, as you represent the German industry, but beyond also a lot of SMEs, what are you telling them also, how should they prepare to the Data Act? And also, according to them and according to you, does that really help to fulfill all these objectives?
I think that's a super interesting and super complex question on both sides. So we talk about data and we talk about cloud, both is in the Data Act. And starting with cloud maybe, the main strategic goal of the regulator and the Commission is to make cloud uptake, to increase cloud uptake in Europe, to use cloud or to bring cloud usage higher as an innovation potential for digital transformation. So the argumentation of the Commission was that cloud uptake is low at some point due to risks of lock-in, risks of not the possibilities to switch. So the Data Act proposal really takes on all those points, as we have heard, and then generally I can say that we agree with the things being said. I liked a lot your 4 points, Mrs. MEP Carvalho, because they really highlight the in a pragmatic approach, how to operationalize portability in a realistic way, because I think you highlighted very well the risks or the obstacles which the cloud service providers and the customers of cloud services will have to follow when they want to switch cloud services. So basically, it's very important in my understanding, our understanding, to raise the awareness in the market that cloud is very important, and there are some risks of switching and lock-in. But it's in general at some point too strong in our understanding. The goal of the Commission to regulate in cloud, because at some point we have, when you look about PaaS and SaaS, go higher into the stack, cloud becomes far more complex. I think IaaS at some point is commodity at some point, but when you think about IoT platforms and software as a service, it becomes far more complex. And functional equivalence and same service type is a very, very complex thing for a CRM system to switch from Microsoft to SAP, for example. So I think this needs to be balanced, and therefore, as said, I liked your considerations, but we really need to talk a lot about, okay, how do we help companies in Europe, how do we help governments in Europe to use the cloud, to use the potentials of the cloud? And we think as Bitkom, those things should happen in parallel. And as said, standards are very important. The very real governance of the Data Act in the future, in a few years, when it's a real regulation, will be very important. Okay, how is the enforcement being done? What are the standards? What is the concrete? What are the concrete things cloud service providers need to do to help their customers switch? Maybe these are a few considerations regarding cloud. You also asked about data economy. And when we discuss data economy, I think we need to look on basically two layers. One thing is the intra-company data readiness, one could say, because we talk a lot about data spaces. It's very important, and I will go into the details too, but it's very important in the first step to look on the data readiness of companies in their intra-organizational setup, because there are a lot of things to do still to get them ready to participate and innovate in data economy. And based on that, it's a continuum. One can say data spaces as a new paradigm, one could say, will really evolve in the next years. We have seen a lot of potential use cases and areas of deployment already today, but also in the past, mentioning mobility data space we discussed today, and also Gaia-X as two examples, but there are many, many more.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Yes, of course.
I fully agree what you have said in relation of the position of the Commission. The Commission has a very good approach to create competitiveness and to force the open up of the switching, but treats sometimes like the switching is a simple process, and you can see that in the time, in several of the time limits that the Commission has proposed, and also on the definition of functional equivalence. So we have, in certain way, tried to amend the concept of the functional equivalence, because it can be very, very complex, the process. And also the time limits, we need to be a bit more flexible, because there are some switching that can be done faster, but there are some that if a big institution wants to switch, is a very complex operation, so we cannot treat everything with the same kind of time schedule. So I fully agree with you, and it's also where we have a different approach from the Commission is on these topics.
Thank you. Before you go, I wanted to give you the word. Yes.
Fully agreed with what was just told. What I would like to add is that, yes, of course, migration, changing, is difficult. And that's why, even on this ground, we must ensure transparency and trust. And I think that, as I told, cloud cannot be a prison, even a golden prison. Cloud must be open, must offer flexibility, and that's why having an approach based on open sources, for example, is something that we must explore. I know that European providers are have a very open source approach. It must be promoted. because it's key to make easy this switch between providers.
Maybe you have time for one more, a couple of comments. I was wondering if there is anything that you think in the Data Act could still use some improvements, and if there's some risks that the Data Act might be oblivious to that would lead to us not seeing the cloud market that we'd like to see for the EU.
Yes, indeed. In terms of definitions, some aspects of the Data Act must be improved on it. You talked about functional equivalence, of course. It's one of it's key. The switching fees is something that must be clarified too, because the situation of the egress fees is not fully clear. It's not crystal clear for us. And we think that we must have a definition of the switching fees that is complete and must avoid any penalty fees, indeed. We must clarify who are the companies that are concerned by the Data Act too. We must have all cloud service providers, all data processing activities companies, with no exception. So it's yes, there are some improvements.
Thank you very much. Did you want to maybe add anything to this on the improvements that are still necessary?
I can basically agree with most of what has been said. I think it needs to be far more clearer what functional equivalence really means, especially as already mentioned when it comes to the variety of service types we see in the data processing market. Also, when it comes to other layers of the Data Act or other parts of Data Act which not deal with cloud directly, we see a lot of risk when it comes to IP protection within data sharing requirements, and we also see a lot of risks in B2G mandatory data sharing, as we see a potential very broad scope and potentially a lot of use cases where companies need to share data with government, also data with science, where we see risks that may be to be added.
Thank you very much. And what about on perhaps international data transfers? Is that something you've been also looking at?
Yes, indeed. We need to give a clear framework for this kind of transfer, and we would like to have. Currently in Europe, the personal data is protected. We have a high level of protection on those data, and it's important. Our level of protection is so good that many countries all around the world are now adopting their GDPR-like regulation. And I think with EH Cloud thinks that we should go have a kind of, I don't know if it's similar approach, but an approach of protection for other data as sensitive data. Data currently is at heart for many businesses, for many sectors of activity. If you, I don't know, but if you have a missile or missiles on your country, you will never let the guidance system of your missile in the hands of another country. It does not make sense. So we believe that for some sensitive data, you should not accept to let this data in the hands of foreign entity without knowing what we'll do. If you have this information, okay, everyone can choose what it does with the data, where the data is, who can access it, who can use it, for what purpose, etc. If you do not have the information, you cannot choose. So yes, the transfer of data for us needs to be more, how to say, we need a clear framework for it to protect the data that deserves to be protected. And I think that each industry, each company has data that it wants to be protected.
Thank you. The Commission claims that there are no localization requirements in the Data Act, and I wonder why do I still keep hearing that from industry and others? Did you have anything to comment on that?
I can comment on that, but it was 2 sentences given international data transfers in general. I liked a lot the approach of like risk classes. Companies have different levels of risk they see when it comes to different types of data. And I think we need to find a framework for international data transfers, both for private or GDPR-related data and non-personal data within Data Act, to really allow international data transfers for globally operating companies who have plants all over the world, like Siemens or BMW. But we also have like data from healthcare or from public sector, for example, where you don't need international data transfers. So that's really following your approach to have different levels, different needs for international data transfer, and also there for different levels of protection regimes. Following your point, your question, we have a very concrete question regarding international data transfers and data localization within Data Act. We see risks, especially in this point for international data transfer for non-personal data in manufacturing or automotive, for example, that exactly this cannot be fulfilled with the rules being presented by Commission when it comes to international data transfers for non-personal data. So we therefore don't agree with the Commission in this context.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn to the audience, perhaps, if they still have time to take 1 or 2 questions. Looking at Pencho. Anyone? Everyone's hungry. All right, everyone's shy. Thanks for letting me down. I have actually many more questions, but being mindful of time, I wanted to give perhaps a final word to you, Maria.
I want to touch the question what to improve in the Data Act, apart from what I have said, is to achieve consensus, because this is the EPP position, doesn't mean that is the position of the other groups, and we are far from getting an agreement, so that is the most important topic. On the definitions, I have changed and trying to improve the definition of the functional equivalence and the egress fees. We still can improve more, but the most important point is the negotiations that we are very far yet from getting an agreement or a majority for the negotiations inside the Parliament. So if you can help.
Thank you very much once more. Unless anyone really has comments? No? All right. Please join me in a range of applause for our panelists here today.
The closing remarks go to someone that was virtually with us and now is in person. I greatly appreciate your engagement with the European Data Summit, dear Damian. Also Shadow Rapporteur for the Data Act. And yeah, the privilege belongs to you.
Thanks a lot. So I think you had quite intense days, so I won't bore you with a lot of content now in summarizing the summit, but I obviously just want to thank Pencho and everyone who organized this amazing summit to make it such a fruitful exchange. So first of all, a round of applause to you. Yeah. So for me, obviously, it's always fun if you jump from horizontal legislation then to a lot of like sectoral examples like mobility, healthcare, cloud service provision. I mean, these are all very specific issues that need specific solutions. And then on the other side, the Data Act tries to solve them all. So you can imagine how Johannes, who's my assistant, works on this with me, and I have felt when we negotiated both the Data Governance Act, which was also a one-size-fits-all weapon, and now the Data Act. And now I'm happy that for the second time we can also be here to discuss both of them with you in a second year. I think maybe there are 3 takeaways that I get from these discussions. And the first one is that we need to be clear about nuanced and clear communication about what we want. So, you know, when I was negotiating in the Special Committee for Artificial Intelligence in the last round of negotiations, we had a conversation about what an algorithm is. And that is a bit sad, you know, if you have a whole process of trying to get to an AI report in the parliament, and then somebody says, yeah, but we need if the algorithm has to tell me that I have cancer, it needs to know my name. And then I said, like, no, the algorithm doesn't need to know your name to tell you that you might have a higher likelihood of having a certain type of cancer. You can just type your data, the algorithm tells you the answer, and then yes, the algorithm can even use this data to improve their functioning, but it doesn't need your name. You know, it really doesn't care about you, I'm sorry. So the question is, you know, how can we get to a good understanding and a nuanced understanding of what we want and what are the actual facts and the actual conflicts of potential privacy with the functionalities that we want. And they're not always there, but they are there sometimes. And that is, I think, the second step, to be honest about when we do have ideological or, let's say, value differences. Because you can value privacy over health to a certain extent. Yeah, you can value health over privacy. So there, I think it's good to have different opinions and then see where we can land with the society. But please, let's not make conflicts where there are none. I think we have to have a nuanced, clear conversation about what the actual conflicts are and where we see them. That's the first point, a nuanced, differentiated discussion. The second one is, I think we can see that there's a range of responsibilities that we have as different actors. So as government, especially as a European Union, we have to show that regulating is better than non-regulating. I was in the US a half year ago, and I tried to talk about industrial data sharing regulation with them. So there was just blank faces, both from the industry as well as from the regulator. They had no idea what I was talking about because they're still thinking about privacy regulation and they really don't know why we should even think about industrial data sharing regulation. And the sentence I took with me was, you know, it's not cool to be a champion in regulation, Damian. So I was like, okay, we have to actually prove that wrong. We have to prove that it's better to regulate in certain ways, in a way that is clear and nuanced, and that this model beats the model of no regulation in the US or of complete ownership by the state in potentially other areas of the world. Yeah? So let's try to fix that, and I think for that we need clear regulation that knows what it's solving. But also actually for businesses, I think, I mean, this is the responsibility for regulators, but for businesses, please try to, you know, not dislike competition. Don't try to manifest your current positions as existing businesses via, I don't know, trade secrets or via like all these kind of beautiful regulatory hurdles that you can build into the regulation with the current influence you have and the interests you have, by then stopping new competition and then weakening the European Union as a whole. So this cannot be. Like this, we can't get to competitive markets. I think they're legitimate interests, but we have to make sure that we don't destroy future business, and I would ask you to be a bit daring when it comes to this. And for research and academia, I think we saw also at this conference, there's a huge interest in understanding things from a competition perspective, from like a technical perspective, from a legal perspective. So we need you to work together to help us understand from all the different disciplines of how we can actually get to the best result. And then the last point I cannot leave out without you know, being here as a member of a European movement, we have to think European. I think what really does not work at all is to have single countries go in certain ways, dissect our data market even more, make it even more difficult for smaller industries, smaller businesses to actually evolve. We need to think European in a way that we have a great regulation that works for a European data market so that you don't cross legal borders constantly. So with this, I'm sure we get to the fair, innovation-friendly, and trusted and sustainable data economy. Thanks a lot again for the organization, the great discussions, and have a fantastic afternoon and weekend. Thank you.
Many thanks, dear Damian. My last task is to invite you for a drink of wine. I can't sum up in a better way than Damian did it right now. Of course, we want sound regulation, and of course, we want better impact, and of course, we want at the end more level playing field in Europe. And what matters to us, hopefully, we would like to achieve one day sustainable data economy in Europe. And this summit was about, that's about. I hope we had kind of impact, and I hope that these kind of discussions will help the legislator to get, at the end of the day, better legislation that will help achieve our goals. Many thanks. The 5th European Data Summit goes to end, and have a good end of the year. Many, many thanks.
Ein Angebot der Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung.